Thomas Galliano was the kind of boss who could rule a kingdom without leaving a fingerprint. Born Tommaso Galliano on May 29, 1883 in Italy, he would go on to become one of the quietest, most calculating figures in American organized crime. A man so discreet that even federal agents struggled to leave a paper trail on him. From the 1930s until his death in 1951, he commanded what would later be called the Lucchese crime family, one of New York's infamous five families, but did it with such surgical precision and low visibility that you could count the newspaper mentions of his name on one hand. Galliano and his brother-in-law, Nunzio Pomila, weren't just relatives, they were business partners. Together they operated lathing and hoisting companies out of the Bronx, legitimate fronts that masked the deeper architecture of their empire. Long before he wore the crown, Galliano served as underboss to Gaetano Tom Rayner, the powerful boss who controlled a monopoly over ice distribution in the Bronx, a critical racket in the days before widespread refrigeration. Within that family, Galliano wasn't just another button man, he was part of the inner circle. Alongside Gaetano Tommy Lucchese and Stefano Steve Rondelli, Galliano was one of the most influential figures behind Rayner's throne. But power in the underworld never stays still. When Rayner was taken out in 1930, another casualty in the cold calculus of Luciano's rise, there was no ceremony, no vote. Galliano, the quiet operator, stepped into the role of boss. Pinzola was briefly handed the keys, but he was never meant to last. The real power shifted to Galliano, and from that moment on, the crime family bore his name. Unlike the flamboyant dons of his era, Galliano didn't want a crown. He wanted control. Silent control. He built empires in the shadows, meat, produce, construction, and then outsourced his power to trusted lieutenants like Lucchese and Rondelli. He didn't need to sit at every table. He just needed to know the chairs were his. He let his allies build their own domains, invest where they wanted, expand their rackets how they saw fit. In return, they pledged allegiance to the old man in the Bronx who never needed to raise his voice. His power wasn't flashy. It was structured, generational, and cemented by marriages, shared bloodlines, and handshake deals stretching from New York to the outer boroughs of the American underworld. Galliano understood that lasting power came not from killing loudly, but from staying alive quietly. He had learned the hard truths of leadership by watching men like Rayner, respected, educated, even admired, get cut down when their time ran out. Even when the feds came sniffing, Galliano left them with scraps. In 1933, United States Attorney George Medley listed him among a slew of underworld figures nailed on tax fraud and racketeering charges. But unlike the rest, Galliano slipped through without fanfare. No headlines, no courtroom drama, just a quiet mention in the daily news as a Bronx building trades racketeer who got pinched with the likes of Joseph Castaldo, the so-called Artichoke King. It was as close as the press ever got. 2 years later, in 1935, his name surfaced again, not in a front-page exposé, but buried in a bankruptcy filing. He owed over $350,000 and listed the United States government as his largest creditor, $281,000 in back taxes. It wasn't uncommon for men like Galliano to use bankruptcy as a shield. He wasn't broke. He was just rearranging the pieces, moving money the way other men moved muscle. In 1937, when his wife Frances died in Jamestown, the obituary read like any immigrant family's farewell. A mother of 6, a devoted churchgoer, a widow of quiet faith. No mention of rackets, no whispers of power. Just a woman who had come to America 36 years earlier and left behind daughters and sons. To most, it was an unremarkable death notice. But to those who understood the architecture of Galliano's world, it marked the passing of a matriarch in a dynasty built on silence. Until the day he died in 1951, Galliano was never dragged into the kind of scandal that brought down flashier men. There were no hearings, no microphones, no federal commissions trying to crack him open. He left behind no confessions, no memoirs, and very little paper. What he left instead was a family, disciplined, feared, and quietly ascendant. His chosen successor, Tommy Lucchese, didn't have to take over. He simply continued the tradition, power without exposure, loyalty without noise. By 1966, the Galliano name echoed far beyond the quiet corners of the Bronx, where Tommy Galliano had once ruled in silence. What began as a tight-lipped crew of builders and racketeers had, over the decades, spread through the arteries of America's criminal underworld, from the garment factories of New York to the fruit docks of New Orleans. And at the heart of this sprawl stood three names worth remembering: Frank Galliano, Dominic Alonghi, and Tommy Galliano. Tommy was the architect. A quiet monarch in a noisy kingdom, he ran the Bronx with measured discipline and left behind a family structure that would become the Lucchese crime family. But his influence wasn't confined to New York. He had blood and loyalty scattered across state lines, through men like Frank Galliano, his distant relative, the son of a deported mafioso. Frank was no street corner thug. He was plugged directly into the southern circuits of Cosa Nostra. In New Orleans, he operated alongside Carlos Marcello and Joseph Marcello, men who had turned port rackets into empires. Then there was Dominic Alonghi, Tommy Galliano's relative by marriage, and Frank's cousin. Alonghi didn't just chauffeur Thomas Eberly, the future Genovese boss. He shadowed him, guarded him, absorbed everything. He'd eventually climbed to underboss himself, but in the 1950s he was still just another trusted soldier. That trust would be tested and confirmed in 1957, when both he and Frank Galliano were arrested trying to flee the infamous Appalachian Meeting, a summit of mob royalty busted wide open in the backwoods of New York. It was one of the few times their names landed in print. But their true power wasn't measured in headlines. It moved through the ports, through crates, manifests, and supply chains. The Galliano name didn't just echo in New York. It thrived in New Orleans, where the docks were choked with imported fruit and the air was heavy with ripening contraband. This wasn't just about street-level shakedowns. It was industrial, massive, legal on the surface, criminal beneath. The produce trade, especially bananas, was king. Bananas, plantains, papayas, pineapples, avocados, guavas, and dozens more were shipped in from Central America and the Caribbean, funneled through ports like New Orleans, and distributed across the country. United Fruit may have monopolized the trade on paper, but it was the mob, through men like Frank Galliano and the Marcellos, who controlled the real flow. And it wasn't just fruit. These networks carried influence, bribes, and untraceable cash. They connected the Lucchese and Genovese families to the Southern Syndicate, to men like Trafficante in Florida, and to the powerful Marcello brothers in New Orleans. By the 1960s, the Mafia had their fingerprints on everything from cargo manifests to garment tags. It all came to a boil in September 1966, at a restaurant in Forest Hills, Queens, La Stella. What was supposed to be a quiet luncheon turned into a national headline. Cops raided the place mid-meal, catching a table full of alleged mob bosses just as the linguine hit the table. Among those arrested, Santo Trafficante of Florida, Carlos and Joseph Marcello of New Orleans, Anthony Carolla, another key New Orleans figure, and Frank Galliano himself. The bill came to $49.50. The tip, interrupted by sirens. A week later, undeterred, they returned to the same table. Same clams, same espresso, same law enforcement tale. When asked why, Trafficante's lawyer shrugged. It's the best restaurant in the neighborhood. Before a Queen's grand jury, none of them said a word beyond name, age, and address. The Fifth Amendment was their entree. They were released on $100,000 bail each, listed as material witnesses in a grand jury probe not only into Cosa Nostra activity, but into a string of unsolved gangland murders in Queens. Still, none of them blinked. While prosecutors dug through address books confiscated from Trafficante, names, numbers, possible contacts, Carlos Marcello flew home to New Orleans and was promptly arrested for punching an FBI agent at the airport. He said he thought the guy was a reporter. In the grand jury's waiting room, some of the mobsters had shown up with suitcases, ready to do the 30 days for contempt, if that's what it came to. They weren't new to this. They were built for silence. By October 1966, the ripple from La Stella was becoming a full-blown storm. What began as a routine raid on a mafia lunch had turned into a courtroom circus, a grand jury tug-of-war that pulled in the biggest names in Cosa Nostra. The 13 mobsters who had been dragged out of their linguini now found themselves tethered to a Queens courthouse, dragged from state to state, subpoena to subpoena, under orders to testify about things no one in their world ever said out loud. The frustration was palpable. Santo Trafficante had flown in from Tampa. Carlos and Joseph Marcello had come up from New Orleans, dragging Frank Gagliano and Anthony Carolla with them. All 5 sat for hours in a grand jury waiting room. No questions, no courtroom, just the ticking clock of legal theatre. Their lawyers seethed. Frank Regano, Trafficante's mouthpiece from Florida, snapped at reporters. Why should he have to do this? He's not a defendant. Jack Wasserman, representing the Marcello crew, echoed the sentiment. These men are witnesses, not suspects. They deserve better than this. But inside that courthouse, prosecutors weren't dealing with tourists. These were mob tacticians who had spent decades dodging subpoenas, ducking murder raps, and outlasting grand juries. They came prepared. When finally summoned, men like Dominic Alonghi, Agnello della Croce, and Frank Galliano invoked the Fifth like it was muscle memory. Alonghi, the Genovese enforcer and cousin to Frank Galliano, said nothing. Della Croce, the Gambino underboss, claimed ignorance so aggressively he had to leave the room after every question to consult with counsel. After 3 questions and 3 exits, the prosecutor gave up. What was really unfolding behind those courtroom walls wasn't about the La Stella lunch. It was about murder. Hidden behind sealed affidavits and stone-faced lawyers was a blood-soaked struggle for control of Mason Tender's local number. 13, a bricklayers' union in Astoria with over 1,000 members and a cash pipeline tied to loan sharking, gambling, and kickbacks. At the heart of it all was Mike Miranda, the aging Cosa Nostra figure who, according to investigators, had been collecting a protection payment of $1,200 a month since 1938. The union had paid him loyally for over a quarter of a century. Now, the bodies were piling up. Liborio Marino was gunned down in 1964. George Cervone, a former union official, was executed in his summer home in Long Beach on July 3, 1966. Joseph Cannistrati, a 348-pound financial hustler, was found shot to pieces along the Long Island Expressway just weeks before the hearings. And Vincent Siciliano, the ex-con who allegedly inherited the gambling operation, had survived 3 attempts on his life, the latest of which left his Cadillac riddled with 12 bullets in the driveway of his Astoria home. The affidavit at the center of the case, filed by Patrolman Edward with help from informants, linked all 3 murders and every surviving witness to the battle for control of Local 13. But the district attorney's office had kept the document under wraps, refusing to file it as public record. When Supreme Court Justice Peter Farrell asked where the affidavit was, the room turned tense. "That paper is public," he snapped. "Now where is it?" Queen's prosecutors scrambled. Farrell ordered it filed, copied, and delivered to the defense. What had started as a strategic lockdown now looked like bureaucratic sabotage. The defense lawyers saw their opening. Wasserman and Regano prepared to challenge the legality of the subpoenas, but their clients weren't eager to burn 30 days in contempt. "Of course my client will testify if ordered," Regano said. Behind closed doors, they were weighing their odds. What was safer, jail time or breaking omerta? Meanwhile, the Marcello brothers and Trafficante were brought back for another round. They said nothing. Hentel's office, still without its key affidavit on public record, prepared to push for contempt charges. Even Carlo Gambino, who had stayed behind in Brooklyn, citing a heart condition, was now under court order to appear and explain why he dodged the proceedings. No one was above this dragnet, not even the boss of bosses. In the press pit outside the courthouse, Trafficante gave the reporters a show. When told that Sonny Franzesi of the Colombo family had been arrested for the 1964 murder of Ernie the Hawk Rupolo, a suspected informant found floating in Jamaica Bay, Trafficante just shook his head. "That's terrible," he said with a smirk. "But what can you do with the kind of help you get nowadays?" Then he laughed, slapped a reporter on the back, and strolled off like a man without a care in the world. In the world of Carlo Gambino, brutality was a given, and sadism wasn't an outlier. It was the cost of doing business. The Mangano brothers weren't just figures in the underworld, they were juggernauts in some of the most dangerous rackets New York had ever known. Their crew was a gallery of killers, men who had once taken orders from Murder Incorporated and were now answerable only to blood and fear. Among them stood Albert Anastasia, the so-called Lord High Executioner, who ruled with his brother, Tough Tony, by his side. Gambino served under Anastasia, a quiet figure with lethal instincts, watching and learning as the streets bent to the will of violence. But loyalty in that world was layered with tension. While Gambino owed his position to Anastasia, he was never fully at ease. Anastasia was erratic, paranoid, prone to violence, and impossible to predict. His obsession with Lucky Luciano wasn't just professional. It bordered on reverence. Anastasia couldn't stand the Manganos, and the feeling was mutual. The brothers resented his proximity to Luciano, his access to power, his arrogance. Yet no matter how loudly they grumbled, when Costello or Luciano issued an order, it was Anastasia who made it happen. The Mangano brothers didn't even warrant a second thought. Gambino, ever cautious, walked the tightrope. He knew how thin the ice was. Anastasia's recklessness on one side, the Mangano's suspicion on the other. He played diplomat, keeping the brothers close enough to feel respected, and Anastasia close enough to avoid provoking his fury. But behind the calm, Gambino was always watching, one eye on the Manganos, the other on Anastasia, waiting for the ground to shift. In those uneasy moments, he would glance over at Tommy Lucchese and ask, almost casually, "How's your old man doing?" That old man was Tom Galliano, Lucchese's boss, and one of the last true architects of the American mafia. His influence stretched far beyond New York, quietly woven into the national structure. But Lucchese looked tired. Galliano was aging, and the weight of leadership was slowly passing to him. Lucchese understood the value of silence. He didn't need the spotlight. He let his people grow, let them run their rackets so long as the envelopes arrived on time. Gambino admired that. He didn't idolize Anastasia's brutality or the Mangano's ego-driven theatrics. He idolized Galliano, the restraint, the discipline, the structure. And when Gambino's moment came, when it was time to act like a boss, he didn't imitate the blood-soaked bluster of the old world. He built something smarter, quiet, genius. With Lucchese, he had access to the real old guard, the minds who had shaped the Luciano family while Charlie was behind bars. What they needed now was to get Luciano out, The streets were restless. The rackets were too big, too chaotic. Bosses were turning on each other. Luciano, even from prison, was still the only man with the authority to pull the reins. Meanwhile, down south, the New Orleans outfit was surging. Chicago was muscling into the national racing wire, expanding into Texas, threatening the syndicate's hold over southern gambling. Things were fracturing. It wasn't just about leadership. It was about geography, about money, about order. The entire map needed redrawing. New York had to send men south. The South had to send men north. A new structure was overdue, one that could contain the casinos, the wire services, and whatever Siegel was stirring up in Las Vegas. Stefano Magaddino, Santo Volpe, Russell Bufalino, Joe Stassi, Santo Trafficante Senior and Junior, Tom Galliano, Tommy Lucchese, Mike Miranda, Vito Genovese, Joe Profaci, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Jack Dragna, Joe Adonis, the Mangano Brothers, the Chicago Outfit, Phil Dandy Castell, Mo Dalitz, Joe Zerilli, Joe Profaci, Abner Zwillman, John Scalish, the New Orleans Mafia under Carlos Marcello. None of these men were fools. They never risked their own money unless the odds were fixed in their favor. But now they were growing uneasy. A new project, spearheaded by a volatile Jewish gangster named Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, was burning through their cash like kindling in a bonfire. Siegel had earned his stripes. In California, he had kept wild men like Mickey Cohen in line, which in itself made him a legend. He carried the kind of respect that few outside the Italian underworld ever earned. But where Siegel saw his future wasn't New York, or even Los Angeles. It was in the desert. New Orleans had long been a gangster's paradise. Casinos, brothels, narcotics, all of it illegal and protected. But what if, Siegel asked, there was a place where it was all legal? That place was Nevada. The state had just opened its doors to legalized gambling. Siegel, sensing the opportunity of a lifetime, moved into Las Vegas like it was the promised land. What stunned the rest of organized crime wasn't the move. It was the money. They had all built gambling halls in cities where the law was an obstacle. But Siegel was sinking millions into the sand, acting like the desert would bloom just for him. Luciano, from inside prison, had given his blessing. Costello raised the funds, pulling from syndicates coast to coast. But now, with the war coming to an end and Luciano's release looming, the whispers were turning to accusations. What the hell had Siegel done with all their money? Gambino had skin in the game. Through Tommy Lucchese, he'd invested heavily in West Coast operations, quietly, carefully, with the expectation of returns. But with Siegel hemorrhaging funds and Costello covering shortfalls by pulling from other rackets, the whole thing was becoming a threat to their future. Siegel wasn't just mismanaging a casino, he was gambling with everyone's dreams. Nobody knew what Siegel's endgame was. All they knew was that the money was gone. And when the bosses in New York started asking where it went, all fingers pointed to Costello. He was draining legitimate businesses just to keep Siegel's Vegas fantasy alive. Meyer Lansky, by then, had turned his focus elsewhere. He was building a global empire in Miami, the Bahamas, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. He was going international. Vegas didn't concern him, not the way it did Gambino and Lucchese, who were watching Siegel endanger everything they'd built in America. On top of that, Siegel's life was spiraling. His relationship with Virginia Hill was a constant tabloid mess, and her wild spending only added to the firestorm. The only man who might have brought order to the chaos was sitting behind bars. But word on the street was he wouldn't be there much longer, thanks to an old friend named Albert Anastasia. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the shock rippled across oceans and continents. America, the so-called sleeping giant, had been violently shaken awake. In that moment, it wasn't just battleships that burned. It was the beginning of the end for an entire era of global empires. In 1941, the world map was still carved up by imperial power. The British Empire stretched across India, Africa, the Middle East and beyond, controlling ports, trade routes and remote island territories that would one day become tax shelters and organized crime havens. The French, desperate to reassert their grip after the Nazi occupation, held onto Indochina and swathes of Africa. The Dutch, the Belgians, the Portuguese, the Italians, and the remnants of Franco's Spain all clung to their colonial holdings, though cracks were beginning to show. The illusion of permanence was wearing thin. By the end of the Second World War, the unravelling was unmistakable. The British lost India in 1947 and collapsed in Suez by 1956. The French bled out in Vietnam by 1954 and in Algeria by 1962. One by one, former colonies began peeling away from their imperial masters. Even the Dutch were driven out of Indonesia, and the Portuguese would hold on until 1974 before their African possessions slipped through their fingers. Carlo Gambino had witnessed 2 world wars, but he had also lived through the fall of empires. And while kings and parliaments watched their flags pulled down across continents, the United States was rising, fueled not just by bombs and bullets, but by something older and darker: leverage. America didn't just inherit the globe, it learned how to control it. With the Cold War looming, Washington saw the vacuum and filled it not just with money, but with networks. In Italy, to keep the communists out, they armed the mafia. In France, they turned to Corsican gangsters to keep the ports under control. It was quid pro quo, guns and protection, in exchange for access to unions, docks, and most importantly, heroin. And at the center of this growing underworld economy sat men like Carlos Marcello, the boss of New Orleans, and quiet operators like Gambino, who understood that true power didn't need to shout. It wasn't all there yet in the 1940s. The heroin explosion was still just a trickle. But by the 1950s and 1960s, that trickle would become a river, running from European banks in London and Marseille, through American ports, into the veins of a generation. The logistics were mafia-run. The cover came from political friends. And the money went everywhere. But it didn't start in a boardroom or an embassy. It started with a fire. In late January 1942, Lucky Luciano was still locked away in Dannemora. His power was intact, but distant. He needed a way back in, a demonstration that only a man like him could deliver. That's when Albert Anastasia pitched an idea to Frank Costello. Costello took the meeting seriously. Anastasia, already feared as the Lord High Executioner of Murder Inca, had been talking to his brother, Tough Tony Anastasio, a heavyweight on the docks with serious pull inside the International Longshoremen's Association. Naval intelligence had been sniffing around, worried sick about sabotage on the Hudson. The docks were a security nightmare. Foreign workers, underworld connections, loose lips. The Navy was in a panic. So, Albert gave them a reason to panic. The SS Normandy, once the crown jewel of the French ocean liner fleet, was docked at Pier 88 on Manhattan's west side. The US was planning to retrofit it into a troop carrier for the war. Albert's idea was simple: burn it. Not beyond recognition, but enough to rattle the system. Enough to remind the Navy just how fragile their waterfront really was. According to Costello, the operation was greenlit quietly. "I didn't figure it was really going to hurt the war effort," he'd later say. "The ship wasn't ready. No American boys were on it. Besides, Albert hated the fucking Navy anyway." A few nights later, smoke rose over the Hudson. The Normandy was engulfed. Firefighters couldn't save her. Within a day, the ship listed to its side, a steel corpse draped in ash and black water. The official reports blamed welding accidents, spontaneous combustion, maybe even sabotage. No conclusive answers ever came, but the effect was immediate. Public panic, headlines, congressional pressure. Suddenly, the Navy wanted protection, real protection. And there was only one place they could turn: the mob. It wasn't about patriotism, it was about leverage. Luciano's people would secure the docks, keep labor in line, sniff out threats before they spread. In return, the government would owe a debt that would come due when Luciano's prison sentence came up for review. What started with a fire on a French luxury ship became a handshake between organized crime and the US government, one that would stretch across decades, wars, and continents. It wasn't just a fire. It was a message, one that didn't need to be signed. Speculation exploded. Sabotage? Nazis in the harbor? Fascist sympathizers on the docks? Or something darker, an inside job from the very men moving cargo and calling shots along the Hudson? Inside naval intelligence, the panic was immediate. The port of New York wasn't just a port. It was the artery of the American war effort, handling nearly half the country's foreign trade. 200 piers, thousands of trucks, rail cars packed to the edge. The movement of men, munitions, and material, all depending on longshoremen, many of them Sicilian or Italian, many answering to the International Longshoremen's Association. And everyone in government knew exactly who ran the union: the mafia. Even before the Normandy went down, the Navy suspected leaks. German U-boats were surfacing off the coast with uncanny timing, sinking convoys, picking off cargo ships like they had the convoy schedules in hand. In March 1942 alone, 50 Allied ships were sunk. Submarines weren't hunting, they were harvesting, and someone somewhere was feeding them information. Bombing Nazi submarine pens in France didn't change anything. The Atlantic kept swallowing American ships. So Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox bypassed the bureaucracy and carved out a new intelligence unit, one that would report only to him. It was headquartered in New York's 3rd Naval District, covering New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut. This was off-the-books, no-rules intelligence work. Running it was Lieutenant Commander Charles Radcliffe Haffenden, a brawler in a Navy uniform, not some Ivy League bureaucrat. He'd earned his stripes in the trenches of World War I and didn't care for protocol. "I'll talk to anybody," he told his staff. "A priest, a gangster, or the devil himself, if they've got what I need." And in New York, the men with the information didn't wear uniforms. They wore pinstripes, smoked cigars, and kept their mouths shut. The naval intelligence men who came before him had failed. They'd walked the docks like school teachers in a war zone, trying to make small talk with men who ran on bribes and loyalty. Haffenden knew better. He didn't just need information. He needed control. So he called the only man in New York who had a track record dealing with the mafia, Thomas E. Dewey, the Manhattan district attorney who'd made his name putting racketeers in prison. Dewey was moving toward the governor's mansion by then, but he assigned the job to someone who knew the terrain. Murray Gurfein, a sharp federal investigator who had helped put Lucky Luciano behind bars. If the Navy wanted access, they'd need someone who could make the call and have it answered. That man was Joseph Sox Lanza, boss of the Fulton Fish Market, king of seafood in New York, and a madman in Luciano's empire. Nothing moved on the docks. No boat unloaded, no box of fish rolled out. Without Lanza's say-so and $100 tribute. He'd faced murder charges, labor wars, extortion indictments, and walked away each time. From a prison cell in Michigan, he still ran the market like it was his birthright. But even Lanza didn't move without checking with his own bosses: Adonis, Costello, Lansky, Luciano. Costello had stood as best man at Lanza's wedding. These men weren't friends. They were family. By blood, by war. by oath. Huffenden met Lanza in secret, at midnight, on a park bench near Grant's tomb. No uniforms, no witnesses. Huffenden laid out the pitch. The Navy needed to plant communications gear in the fish market and put undercover men aboard boats suspected of aiding the Germans. Lanza nodded, partially. He'd allow it in the market, but for full cooperation across the waterfront, the Navy would need to go higher. "If you want real results," Lanza said, "you'll need Charlie Lucky." Luciano, sitting in Dannemora on a 30 to 50-year stretch, thanks to the same prosecutors now whispering about cutting a deal. The Navy wasn't ready to go to him directly, so Gurfein called Luciano's lawyer, Moses Polakov. A quiet breakfast was arranged, no press, no fanfare. Polakov brought Maya Lansky. Lansky remembered it clearly. Gurfein explained the situation. Lansky spoke to Costello. Then they reached a decision. Frank was a patriot, Lansky would later say. He said we should help. So we decided to tell Lucky that helping the Navy might help him get out. As the war raged, Joe Sox Lanza became a national asset. He wasn't a gangster anymore. He was infrastructure. At another midnight meeting, Gurfein laid it out bluntly. "You know the docks. You know who's doing what. The Navy doesn't. We need you." Shortly after, Lanza was shaking hands with Commander Huffenden at the Astor Hotel. "I want you to be a patriotic American," Huffenden said. Lanza agreed to help, but everyone knew he still needed Luciano's blessing. That blessing came quietly, behind closed doors. Lansky took the call, Costello gave the nod, Sox obeyed, and Operation Underworld, the top-secret alliance between the US Navy and the Italian Mafia, was born. Luciano didn't sign any paperwork. He didn't sit in a war room or wear a uniform, but he controlled the men who controlled the docks. If the Navy wanted quiet, uninterrupted flow of cargo, no sabotage, and silence where it mattered, they'd have to play by the underworld's rules. The Mafia didn't just work the waterfront, they owned it. Years later, when Dewey, then governor, commuted Luciano's sentence and sent him back to Italy in 1946, the questions returned. What had Luciano done? What had he been promised? In 1954, William Herlands launched a discreet 9-month investigation. Rear Admiral Carl Espy of Naval Intelligence finally confirmed it. Contacts made with Luciano and his influence on other criminal sources resulted in their cooperation, which was considered useful to the Navy. That was the word useful. Not loyal, not honorable, just effective. In wartime, which was enough. The next morning, the guards at Dannemora walked Charles Lucky Luciano down to the warden's office for a confidential call from New York. The prison doctor, Dr. Martin, handed him the phone with a look that said this wasn't your average check-in. On the line was Frank Costello. "Charlie," he said, "the government wants a favor. Some guys from the Navy Department want to talk to you." Luciano didn't hesitate. "Frank, I'm not talking to anybody from up here. If they're so desperate that they can bring me down to New York, I ain't doing favors from this dump." He made sure to flash a small grin at the warden. Nothing personal, just business. Costello told him to hold. A minute later, he was back. "I'm sitting here with guys from Dewey's office. They said okay, they'll move you to Sing Sing for the meeting. They just need a judge to sign off." Within days, Judge McCook gave the green light. Luciano was pulled out of the cold hell of Dannemora and sent south. "It was like going from Siberia to civilization," he later said. "They gave me a clean cell, hot and cold running water, and real toilet paper. First time in 6 years. You'd be surprised how much that matters when you're locked up." That afternoon, Luciano was escorted to the lawyer's room. Waiting for him were Frank Costello, Maya Lansky, Moses Polakov, and George Wolfe, along with a sharp Navy officer from 90 Church Street, Commander Charles Huffenden, One of Dewey's top men was also in the room, keeping an eye on the whole setup. But Luciano's focus wasn't on the men. It was on the table. It looked like something out of a Lower East Side delicatessen, stacked with cold cuts, hard rolls, kosher pickles, and even bottles of Dr. Brown's Celery tonic. "Before we talk," Luciano said, "you'll have to excuse me." And he made a beeline for the food. Lansky smiled. "For you, Charlie. I stopped down at the pickle factory on Delancey Street. Told them it was for you. They sent their regards. Those pickles are from the top of the barrel." They were the little garlic-soaked ones, crunchy, sharp, the kind that used to fill Luciano's suite at the Waldorf Towers with their smell. "The taste," he said, "was almost as good as freedom." Nobody said a word until he was finished eating. Then the pitch began. Commander Haffenden laid it out. The government needed his help. Specifically, the Navy was struggling to secure the New York waterfront. The longshoremen, the docks, the Union halls, they were vulnerable. Spies, saboteurs, leaks. The war effort was bleeding through the piers, and naval intelligence couldn't plug the holes. Would Luciano use his influence to help? Luciano leaned back. He put on a straight face and thought it over, at least outwardly. Then he asked, cool and dry, "Why are you fellas so sure I can handle all this, locked up in a cage?" Haffenden didn't blink. "We've been told, on very reliable authority, that if you send word, it will be followed." It was all true, and everyone in the room knew it. But Luciano didn't rush. He let the silence hang. This wasn't just about the Navy, it was about leverage. The same system that had railroaded him 6 years earlier was now on its knees, asking for a lifeline. He agreed. Haffenden, visibly relieved, let out a long breath. The man had walked into that room praying Luciano would say yes, and he just had. Then Dewey's man nudged Haffenden to step out of the room and make the call to naval intelligence to let them know the deal was alive. With Haffenden gone, the real discussion could begin. Luciano had finally found his way out of prison, not through patriotism, but through leverage. The kind of leverage only corruption could buy. And now, the man who once made his name busting racketeers, Tom Dewey, was being brought to heel by the very machine he'd spent his career trying to dismantle. Dewey had ambitions. He wasn't just eyeing Albany. He wanted the White House. And for that, he needed votes. He needed Manhattan. He needed the mob. Luciano knew it. So did Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and everyone else sitting at that table. These weren't just gangsters. They were kingmakers. Dewey's people had come to talk national security, but once the kid from Naval Intelligence left the room, the conversation turned real. Luciano laid it out cold. "Here's how we see it," he said. "After Wilkie beat Dewey for the Republican nomination in 1940, the only way Dewey could position himself for a future shot at the presidency was to take the governorship of New York." Costello jumped in. He'd already heard the whispers. The Republican bosses were ready to back Dewey for the 44 presidential run, even though he was campaigning for governor on the promise that he wouldn't run. Luciano made the offer. No subtlety, no poetry. "We'll deliver Manhattan," he said, "or come damn close. That's the deal. You get him elected governor, we'll make him a national name. But once he's in office, he makes me a hero. The kind of hero that gets a parole, not a medal." He was dead serious. "And if he doesn't bite," Luciano warned, "we'll pull all our support. Not just step back, we'll throw it against him." He paused, then twisted the knife. "Even if he still wins governor, come 43, when they start building him up for the presidency, I'll launch my campaign for a new trial. I'll take it to the papers. I'll blow the lid on how Dewey got those broads to perjure themselves, how he bribed witnesses, how he built my case out of lies. Maybe we tried before, but this time, with him gunning for the White House, The press will print every dirty word. I don't mind being the guy who helped make him governor. But President of the United States? On my back with nothing for me? No fucking way. Dewey's guy left to deliver the ultimatum. Luciano stayed behind with Lansky and Costello. He told Polakov and Levy to take a walk. They had other business to discuss. Real business, wartime business, ration stamps, gasoline, black market meat. The war had created shortages. Luciano's crew had created a supply chain. Tommy Lucchese had inherited the restaurants that once paid tribute to Dutch Schultz, and now they were buying meat through syndicate channels. The stamps? Those came from the outfit. The meat? From the streets. Luciano and Costello weren't just pushing paper, they were sitting on a wartime empire. We got a lock on over 400 gas stations, Costello said, from New York down to Louisiana. That's a hell of a racket till the war's over. Meanwhile, Dewey kept climbing. In April 1944, he crushed Wilkie and Harold Stassen in the Wisconsin primary. Wilkie's poor showing forced him out of the race. By the Republican convention, Dewey's rivals had cleared the way. John Bricker fell in line, and Dewey took the nomination nearly unanimously. At just 42, he became the youngest Republican nominee in history. But Luciano was watching closely. Dewey's campaign zeroed in on Roosevelt's New Deal, calling it bloated, corrupt, and riddled with communists. But he steered clear of foreign policy. At one point, he considered dropping a bombshell, the claim that Roosevelt had known about Pearl Harbor in advance and let it happen to draw America into the war. He was talked down by General George Marshall, who warned him it would expose vital secrets about how America had cracked the Japanese Purple Code. Dewey backed off. Roosevelt, in a rare move, began personally briefing Dewey on war efforts, an unprecedented step in American politics. It was the first time an opposition candidate received classified military information during a campaign. But none of it was enough. On November 7, 1944, Franklin Delano Roosevelt defeated Dewey in the general election. FDR pulled 53.4% of the vote to Dewey's 45.9%, a stronger showing than any Republican had managed against Roosevelt, but not strong enough. The Electoral College margin was crushing, 432 to 99. Luciano never forgot it. He'd backed Dewey into a corner. He'd delivered support from men who should have been his enemies, and in the end, Dewey still lost. But the message had already been sent even from prison. Lucky was still pulling strings, not for loyalty, not for love of country, but because he understood how politics worked better than any man in Washington. Before Tom Dewey could even dream of the presidency, he needed Luciano's blessing. Luciano had already made his demands clear: a public clearing of his name, full parole, and unrestricted return to New York. And if Dewey didn't play ball, Luciano made it known. He'd destroy him. The tools were all in motion. The press, the streets, the blackmail. Dewey would be buried under his own past. But Dewey wasn't naive. He understood power. He also understood that the very people pulling strings behind his campaign were the same men negotiating with Luciano to keep America's docks safe. They were playing both sides, and Dewey knew it. Dewey hated communists, hated Roosevelt's people. Hell, he hated Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor. The country still saw Stalin's Russia as an ally, but men like Dewey and the intelligence minds around him already saw the future threat. Propaganda had painted the Soviets as heroes fighting Hitler, but the far right in America wasn't fooled. They despised Roosevelt for aligning with Moscow. They despised the New Dealers who surrounded him. And they loathed the whisper that Eleanor Roosevelt had grown too cozy with socialists, communists, and radicals. That's why J. Edgar Hoover survived. When FDR first entered the White House, Hoover was nearly axed. But then he walked into the Oval Office and dropped a sealed file on the president's desk file about Eleanor. It was never opened. Hoover simply said, "It details your wife's activities, communist and non-communist alike." Roosevelt never looked at it. He changed the subject. But from that moment on, Hoover stayed in power, and Roosevelt let him do what he did best: dig dirt on Nazi sympathizers, socialists, and anyone who could be used or neutralized. The war in Europe was nearly over. The Nazis were collapsing under Allied pressure. But behind the scenes, a new war was taking shape. Dewey's people, and the early minds behind the Office of Strategic Services, Naval Intelligence, and what would soon become the Central Intelligence Agency, were already looking beyond Berlin. They saw the Soviets as the real threat, a power that wouldn't stop when Hitler fell, one that would hold on to Eastern Europe and never give an inch back. Luciano, whether he realized it or not, had become more valuable than ever. America needed him in Italy, in Sicily specifically. They needed a man who could rebuild what war and Mussolini's dictatorship had broken. Someone who could restore order, organize criminal structures, and work with anti-communist networks like Operation Gladio. The men backing Dewey, the ones with badges and sealed budgets, weren't just tolerating Luciano. They were beginning to see him as a tool of policy. Luciano sat in Sing Sing waiting for Dewey's answer. He refused to talk to anyone else. A few days later, Moses Polikoff returned with the terms. It was a yes in principle, but not on Luciano's terms. Dewey had drawn the line. No unrestricted parole. No triumphant return to Manhattan. Dewey's condition was permanent deportation. Luciano could be released, but he would have to leave the country. Forever. Luciano saw it for what it was, a clean political win for Dewey. The tough prosecutor lets the bad guy go, but sends him far, far away. It would make headlines. America cleans house. Luciano gone. The problem? Luciano was a legal US citizen, ever since his father took out papers when he was a boy. He couldn't be deported unless he agreed. And now he understood Dewey's game. In order for me to help him, and more important, not go against him, he was willing to cut me loose, but only if I disappeared, Luciano recalled. It was smart politics. It made him look good. Got rid of the big bad gangster. But it meant sitting in a cage until the war was over. They couldn't deport me to Italy while it was still an enemy country. It was a perfect crime. Almost. Luciano had played the game brilliantly. Every piece had landed where he wanted it. But Dewey's condition boxed him in. Luciano argued, fought, tried to shift the terms. No good. Dewey wasn't budging. In the end, Luciano caved. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than rotting in a cell for the rest of his life. And deep down, he figured he might find a way back someday after the war cooled and the press moved on. There was one final promise from Dewey. No more heat on the outfit. The kind of scorched earth campaigns from 1939 to 1941 would stop. Dewey's men would act sensible. Luciano agreed. The rest was negotiation. $90,000 change hands. Dewey got a contribution for his governor's campaign. Luciano remembered, he wanted more, actually. But after everything that phony conviction cost me, I figured he should be paying me to leave. They settled on $25,000 up front, handed over quietly as a down payment into what was described as a secret campaign fund. The remaining $65,000 would be delivered the day Luciano walked free and boarded the ship to Italy. Cash, small bills, no records, just an escrow bag marked for Dewey. Luciano later checked. The money never appeared on anyone's books. Not his, not Dewey's. And in that, maybe there was the real agreement. A gangster's silence for a politician's future. Once the deal was sealed, Luciano wasted no time laying out the next condition. He pulled Murray Haffenden aside and made a quiet, reasonable suggestion. If he was going to be useful to the war effort, and contribute meaningfully to national defense. It made no sense to keep him locked away in Dannemora, buried in the Adirondacks, hours from anyone he needed to see. How was he supposed to coordinate anything from there? He'd need constant access to his men, not just phone calls, not letters, face-to-face sit-downs with the hierarchy of the American underworld. He named names: Lansky, Costello, Lanza, Albert Anastasia, Tony Anastasio, Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, Adonis, the Inner Circle. These men couldn't be expected to make weekly pilgrimages upstate. Luciano insisted it would be a hardship. For them, for the war effort, and for America. With the quiet consent of Tom Dewey and Judge McCook, Luciano was moved immediately to the country club of the New York prison system, Great Meadow, in Comstock, just north of Albany. Compared to Dannemora, it was paradise. He settled in comfortably. Very comfortably. He had the run of the joint. Meals of his choosing were brought in from the outside, on his dime. He installed personal furniture in his cell. They gave him a private office at the request of Naval Intelligence for meetings tied to the now mythic Operation Underworld. Officially, he was liaising with military men on the protection of ports, intelligence gathering, war logistics. Unofficially, the visitors who streamed in several times a week weren't there to talk about the Nazis. They were there to talk about bookmaking, black markets, ration stamp rackets, and most of all, plans for the post-war world. The warden, Vernon Morehouse, didn't get in the way. A real sweet guy, Luciano would say later. We had him in our pocket. But that wasn't unique. As Luciano saw it, every prison could be greased, some more than others. Morehouse gave him anything that was within reason, and a few things that weren't. Luciano was even allowed, on occasion, to take walks through Albany, escorted by a single guard. No cuffs, just fresh air and the chance to stretch his legs. I gave him my word I wouldn't pull nothing, Luciano later said. And I didn't. I could have ruined him if I broke my word. Still, it wasn't a vacation. The war dragged on until 1945, and the bureaucracy that followed, endless paperwork, red tape, intelligence clearances, meant Luciano didn't walk free until early 1946. That one condition from Dewey, forced deportation, had cost him nearly 3.5 years of his life. And even that, he believed, was only because Dewey didn't have the stomach to sign the parole himself and take the political hit. We had to get things moving long before the war ended, he'd recall. I mean, we needed to start the wheels turning. There was a world waiting for us out there. We need to talk. Tommy Lucchese lit a cigarette, leaned back in his chair, and looked Carlo Gambino dead in the eyes. The room was quiet, window cracked just enough to let the smoke drift into the cold air outside. It's the ration stamps, the oil, the link-ups between New Orleans and a dozen other crews across the country. We've built a machine, Carlo. It's running smoother than anything we ever touched. But I need to know, how are your real bosses taking this? The Manganos? Gambino didn't answer right away. He shifted slightly, his voice low and firm. They're not happy. I won't sugarcoat it. Me, Tough Tony, Albert, even you. We're heading off to see Luciano, and they're not even in the loop. No heads up, no nod of respect. They think we're going around them. Lucchese nodded. They're not wrong. Luciano's pulling Anastasia's strings directly. No courtesy to the Manganos. And Costello's backing every move, funding operations, giving his blessing. It's no secret. The Manganos see it. They're pissed. But as long as the envelopes stay fat and Albert doesn't lose it, they're swallowing their pride. For now. They still respect Lucky, Gambino offered. Lucchese gave a short shrug. Sure, they do. They know what he built. But Albert's different. He doesn't ask, doesn't wait, doesn't bow. And do you tell me, Carlo, who's going to tell Albert Anastasia he's got to kneel before Vincent Mangano before making moves? Who's got the stones to say it to his face? Gambino said nothing. He didn't have to. Lucchese pressed on. Here's the other thing. Galliano's getting old. Everyone sees it. When the time comes, I take over. And when that happens, the game changes. The Manganos, the Profacis, all of them, they'll have to acknowledge me. They'll have no choice. And that means you, Carlo. You've got a boss behind you. One who actually gives a damn about what you want. He let that sit for a moment, then added, Anastasia can bark all he wants, but he won't touch you. Not when he has to deal with me. Not with Luciano, or Costello, or the others in the room. Gambino leaned back, flicked ash into a tray, his face unreadable. Lucchese leaned in again, softer this time. But keep your eyes on the Manganos. They're the ones we have to worry about. They know what's coming. They know I'll be boss within 5 years. And when they see you standing with me, they'll see it for what it is. An alliance. And this one ain't quiet like back in the Prohibition days. This one's out in the open. Lucchese paused, then shifted the subject. Now listen, Luciano wants numbers, real numbers. He wants to know what we've been making. Transportation, garments, black markets, every racket we built on his foundation. And Meyer Lansky's already counting. Gambino finally spoke again, voice heavy. Is it true? What they're saying? Lucchese nodded. Yeah, it's official. Luciano's getting deported the second he's released. Gambino looked down, then up. Name one guy who's ever come back after deportation. I lived in Sicily. I've seen it firsthand. Guys go back. They vanish. Especially the ones who left as kids. Lucky's going back to a wasteland, a place he doesn't even remember. And he's too famous now. He's a ghost returning to a graveyard. Lucchese's expression darkened. He's forfeiting his US citizenship. Got to apply for Italian papers. That passport might get him into Havana, maybe South America. But he ain't ever coming back here. Gambino scoffed. Cuba? Forget it. Batista is Washington's puppet. The minute someone makes a call, Lucky's out. And they both knew it. Luciano's empire was massive. Costello controlled casinos in Louisiana, Arkansas, and beyond. Lansky ran gambling in Miami and Havana, moving American operations into the Gulf and South America. Richie the Boot Boyardo had New Jersey locked. Joe Adonis and Longy Zwillman were holding it down too. Lucky always said he wasn't the boss of bosses. Just a businessman. A man who brought the bosses together to build an empire and split the profits after greasing the right politicians and paying off the law. But with his deportation, another name crept into Gambino's mind. What about Vito Genovese? What's he been up to in Sicily? Lucchese's jaw tensed. He took a deep breath. Vito's another kind of animal. You know what he did? He ordered a hit on a journalist, just to win with Mussolini. Sent Carmine Galante to carry it out. Blew the poor bastard away just to play nice with the fascists. Gambino went still. When he left Sicily, he'd heard the stories, how Mussolini declared war on the mafia, how Sicilians were dragged out of their homes, jailed, beaten, disappeared. Now he was hearing how Genovese played ball with that regime, kissing the ring of a dictator, betraying not just America, but his own people. Vito wasn't even Sicilian by blood, but he was using Mussolini, using the island, turning Sicily into a narcotics pipeline. And with the Allies about to roll through Italy, that whole empire was about to go up in smoke. What Vito didn't understand was this, that pipeline he carved out. That product, it would be worth billions. But not for the Italians. Not yet. The Corsican mafia would step in first, through Marseille, through La Marseillaise, linking back to New York, through guys like Gambino. And in that moment, Gambino saw it. So did Lucchese. They were no longer men playing under the old rules. They were new-era gangsters, ruthless, efficient, forward-thinking. And they would use narcotics not just to fill pockets, but to build empires. That was when Carlo Gambino cracked a subtle smile and leaned toward Lucchese like a priest about to reveal prophecy. The lamp above the table flickered, casting long shadows across their suits. His voice, soft but anchored in steel, barely moved the air. "I've got more than a few connections back home, Tommy. You have to see it like this. When we came here, especially me, I never forgot where we came from. The food, the language, the mannerisms. We're still Sicilians, still Italians. The connection, it never dies. And the Americans? They've fallen in love with it, especially when it's on a plate." Gambino's hand gestured as if presenting a feast. He wasn't talking about pasta. He was talking about power. "The New Orleans boys, they've got the ports locked tight. When goods come in from Europe, they're already greased up. Relationships with companies in Sicily, in Italy, with the big players controlling the olive oil. The same oil that's kept guys like Profaci swimming in legitimacy. But that market, I want it. And most of the old times, they're tired now. Getting older. We can take it, make it legitimate. You and me." Lucchese raised his eyebrows. Gambino leaned closer. "Picture this. We import directly from Sicily with an exclusive contract. We're not just pushing oil, we're pushing culture and tradition. We move it through Little Italy, across Manhattan into Pennsylvania. We cut in a few families and let 'em all eat. But the plate stays ours." That was the kind of move that required more than just a fence and a truck. It needed diplomacy, history, and something Gambino had in spades: roots. Luciano left Sicily when he was a boy, maybe 9. He had power in America, but the island, that belonged to someone else. If anyone was going to connect the wires between New York and Palermo, it was Gambino. The quiet kid from Palermo who never let go of the soil under his nails. Back in the Sicilian hills, while Mussolini was screaming about fascist glory, men like Don Calogero, Don Carlo Vizzini were hiding in the mountains and biding their time. The kind of men who didn't just survive tyranny, they shaped the resistance. Vizzini wasn't just some street boss. He was Sicily. And when the Allies came through, they didn't look to mayors or priests. They looked to him. Gambino knew that. He never forgot it. By the time he became boss, Vizzini was gone, dead in 1954. Don Calogero, Don Carlo Vizzini, wasn't just another old-school boss in Sicily. He was the key to Gambino's foothold overseas. When Gambino managed to install Vizzini as the top man in Sicily, especially in Palermo, it gave him leverage no other American boss had. It wasn't just about respect, it was about reach. Vizzini's proximity to Luciano, who lived only 15 minutes away, made the network tighter, more secure. And it wasn't just the mafia. Don Carlo had a deeper role. He was tied to Operation Gladio, the post-war intelligence web that blurred the lines between national security and organized crime. But the playbook remained. Gambino had bigger plans than just smuggling olive oil. He wanted Sicily in his real estate portfolio, not for show, for infrastructure. He saw the Marshall Plan not just as a European rescue package, but a godsend, a laundering pipeline drenched in legitimacy. Land, oil, produce, even people. Sicily wasn't a memory. It was an investment. But investments needed partners. And as the deportations rolled in during the 1950s, Gambino saw opportunity in the ruin. The Kiefer hearings, the heat on organized crime, it all led to one thing: deportations. Gangsters who'd spent their best years in speakeasies and boardrooms were now broke and stuck in a country they barely remembered. America sent them back like bad mail. These weren't young kids anymore. These were ghosts of the past, guys who'd burned money in the 1930s, spent the 1940s looking over their shoulder, and entered the 1950s with empty pockets. But even ghosts can haunt, and with no jobs, no savings, and no connections, many of them turned to the one thing they still had: contacts. And those contacts started to link up with Corsican traffickers, Sicilian smugglers, and a growing web of post-war underworld players. Narcotics. The heroin war that was coming in the 1950s and 60s didn't start in Marseille. It started in desperation. And men like Gambino understood that. He didn't just want a piece of the pipeline. He wanted to control the tap. That's when the words of Michael Chining, an old INS correspondent stationed in Italy, started to echo. Back in September 1954, Chining had done the unthinkable. He walked straight into the strongholds of the Sicilian mafia and lived to write about it. He got close, too close, to the old power brokers. Don Calogero, Genco Russo, the invisible hands that moved Sicily from behind velvet curtains and blood-soaked oaths. Mussolini tried to wipe them out. He failed. All he did was push them underground. And after the war, those same men were elevated, not erased. Vizzini was even made mayor of Villalba, with the silent blessing of the Americans. Chining's report read like something out of a Gothic novel. Officials warned him to stay out of mafia business. Men of influence with polished shoes and dusty eyes gave him quiet smiles and stern advice. In Palermo's wealthiest district, a man behind a giant desk refused to give a name, but made his point clear. No mafioso has ever killed an honest man. That was the mythology, the self-styled nobility of the mafia. Honor among thieves, justice outside the law. They weren't killers, they claimed. They were judges. If someone died by mafia hands, the story went, he deserved it. At least that's what they told Chining over espresso and nervous laughs. But Chining dug deeper. He talked to men who called Lucky Luciano, Salvatore Lucania, an honorable man. He tried to connect the dots between the Sicily-American handshake that happened when the Allies came ashore and men like Vizzini stepped forward to help. But Vizzini wasn't talking. Luciano wasn't talking. And even Chining, a man used to deal with danger, was eventually silenced with a smirk and a shrug. What he found instead was something older, something buried in feudalism. Sicily, he wrote, wasn't just a place. It was a medieval state of mind. The mafia wasn't born in speakeasies or back alleys. It came from centuries of oppression, where landlords ruled and peasants were kept in check by armed overseers called campieri. These men were the original enforcers. They kept the peace with a whip and a prayer. And eventually, those same enforcers realized they didn't need to serve the lords. They could become them. Protection rackets were born, not out of greed, but out of evolution. And as Sicilians moved to America, they took that formula with them. The rules of justice were different, complex, brutal, and always outside the law. Gambino understood that history. Not just the glamour or the violence, but the psychology, the need to survive, the need to belong, the need to build something that would outlast dictators, presidents, and bloodlines. And now, as the world changed again, Marshall Plan money pouring in, deported gangsters flooding Sicily, the heroin trade exploding, he saw the next frontier. Lucchese saw it too. The relationship between the Italian people, both those born under the sunburned domes of Sicily and those reborn in the American grind, and the United States, has always been a sordid one. In the rugged hills of Villalba, Don Calogero Vizzini ruled not from shadows, but from a stone fortress with a view of the entire valley, a Sicilian baron in everything but name. He owned most of the sulphur trade, vast orchards, and a quiet, paralyzing fear that stretched across western Sicily. No one ran for office, bought land, or planted seeds without his nod. To the locals, he wasn't just a man. He was law, order, and fate. They called him Zi Carlo, Uncle Calogero, with the reverence reserved for saints and executioners alike. By the time World War II ended, Vizzini wasn't just a local power. He had become an indispensable player in a transatlantic arrangement. When Lucky Luciano was deported from the United States in 1946, whispers began that his freedom had come at a steep price. The Mafia's silent cooperation in the Allied invasion of Sicily. There was no paper trail, no confession, only a trail of favors that led to Palermo, and a quiet nod from men like Vizzini. Luciano denied it, of course. But denials didn't mean much in a world where the truth was always paid for in silence. What wasn't denied was their relationship. Vizzini and Luciano weren't just two mobsters in different hemispheres. They were business partners. Luciano brought the post-war network. Vizzini controlled the ports, the land routes, and the loyalty of men who didn't need contracts. They dealt in fruit, sulfur, and eventually the heroin trade. One built the empire in Manhattan. The other secured the safe harbor in Sicily. When Don Calogero died in 1954, they buried him with the solemnity of a head of state. His funeral drew priests, politicians, and peasants alike, men who knew better than to ask questions. He was accused of orchestrating a shooting at a communist rally in 1946, and though convicted, he never saw the inside of a prison. The papers vanished. The appeal dragged on. He died with a clean record, at least on paper. By the early 1960s, Genco Russo stepped into the vacuum, quietly put forward as Vizzini's heir. When the communists raised the alarm and asked the Christian Democrats if they knew who Russo really was, the answer was a shrug. No one admitted to knowing anything. Russo, too, said nothing, and withdrew his candidacy for personal reasons. What made Vizzini unique wasn't just the power he held. It was how seamlessly he bridged the old world and the new criminal order rising in post-war Sicily. He was the model for a new kind of Don, fluent in tradition, anchored in bloodlines, but open to business beyond the island. His legacy wasn't just orchards and sulfur, it was a blueprint, one that men like Luciano followed, refined, and exported back to America. When Police Chief David Hennessy was gunned down in 1890, it didn't just rattle New Orleans, it ignited a wave of violent reprisals against Catholics, especially Sicilians. 11 men were lynched by a mob that stormed the prison in broad daylight. The message was clear. Italians were not yet considered American. The blood on the cobblestones stained more than the city streets. It stained its conscience. Italy and Sicily recoiled in disgust. Diplomatic relations chilled. Tensions crackled across the Atlantic. The Sicilian diaspora, branded and hunted, spread inland to safer ground: Arkansas, Alabama, Texas. That massacre left a scar on New Orleans, and the city's criminal element learned its lesson. They went underground. Shadows became their sanctuary. Carlo Gambino, years later, would study this history closely. He understood instinctively what it meant to operate behind the curtain, to wield power without flashing it. America, to him, was a paradox, the land he loved, but also a country built on contradictions. The government moved like a syndicate. Protection was for the powerful, not the vulnerable. The weak were expendable. No one looked out for immigrants clawing their way through slums and sweatshops. But Gambino did more than survive it. He mastered it. He learned how to read politicians like he read bookmakers, how to deal with the unions, and how to move quietly among the working class and the elite. The streets had their own language, and Gambino spoke it fluently. That moment in 1890, the lynching, the fear, the scapegoating, was never just history. It was a warning. Blend in, move silently, and live to see another day. And it began with a shot in the shadows. A police chief lay dead on the cobbled streets of New Orleans. The year was sometime in the 1890s. Across the Atlantic and decades later, another bullet found its mark, this time in Agrigento, Sicily, where Officer Cataldo Tandoi fell while walking beside his wife. A continent and half a century apart, yet both killings were linked by a whisper carried on the wind. Mafia. For too long, the island of Sicily had remained shrouded in this fog of silence, its cities haunted by men who existed in plain sight, but operated like ghosts, everywhere and nowhere. Now, in 1962, the Italian parliament was stirring. Something had changed. A growing sense of national shame forced the Sicilian legislature to vote, with rare unanimity, for a parliamentary investigation into the mafia. The Italian Senate moved swiftly, proposing that 15 senators and 15 deputies dig deep, beneath the petty muscle to the men with real power. Who were they? How did they remain untouchable? But probing the mafia in Sicily was like asking the FBI to chase phantoms through a haunted house. Palermo's streets echoed with violence. 4 dead in a single January night. No one talked, no one saw. The mafia had settled accounts. Even flowers weren't safe. When a funeral procession rolled through the city, hands reached out and tore petals from wreaths. Why? The florist wasn't recommended. It was a lesson, brutal and symbolic. In this world, even death had to pay tribute. The mafia wasn't merely a criminal group. It was a government within a government, a society above the law. No road could be built, no job offered, no election won without their blessing. It was less an organization than an atmosphere, one that clung to Sicily like a second skin. Back in 1954, when Don Calogero Vizzini died at his estate in Villalba, most believed they were burying the island's silent king. He owned 75% of Sicily's sulfur industry, controlled massive fruit orchards, and was deeply feared. Police believed he had ordered the 1946 shooting of Communist deputy Girolamo Lee Causi at a rally. But 3 times the case files vanished, only to resurface just as mysteriously. Convicted and sentenced to 6 years, Vizzini never saw a prison cell. He died with his appeal pending. In 1960, his ghost rose again. A man named Genco Russo, long rumored to be Vizzini's successor, was placed on the Christian Democratic Party ticket in Musumeli. When challenged, party leaders claimed ignorance, and Russo quietly withdrew for personal reasons. No evidence, no admissions, just silence. Some say the mafia stretches back centuries, born from a mistrust of rulers and judges. The villagers didn't believe in the law, so they made their own. A local man, Don Salvatore, perhaps, became both judge and jury. Those who disobeyed his rulings paid in blood. Over time, that vigilante spirit soured into something darker. Benito Mussolini tried to crush the mafia in the 1920s. He sent black shirts into the hills and boasted of his successes. But it was surface level at best. The mafia survived fascism, war, and American liberation. In 1943, some said Lucky Luciano's connections had aided the Allied landings in Sicily. Luciano denied it. No proof was ever found. But the whispers remained. After the war, deported American mobsters returned to Sicily like ghosts revisiting their birthplace. Men like Frank Coppola, now rumored to control the Palermo region from a quiet farm, cast long shadows. Yet the real power remained with the native-born dons. Sicily's post-war shift from farmland to urban sprawl also shifted the mafia's business. Rackets sprang up in construction, in markets, in retail, even in funeral homes. As money flowed east, the mafia's grip extended toward Catania, Messina, and the oil-rich fields of Ragusa. In the United States, congressional investigations had revealed the mafia's deep involvement in labor racketeering and narcotics. From the days of prohibition to heroin smuggling in the 1950s, the profits were staggering, sometimes as high as 1,500%. In 1958, Senator John L. McClellan declared the mafia a threat to the American economy. Italy now feared the same. And yet, even the act of listening in proved futile. In a 1959 report, George Weller of the Chicago Daily News described Sicily as an island of coded tongues. Detectives from Palermo to Los Angeles strained to decode phone calls between deported gangsters and American bosses. They talked about oranges, but there were no oranges. Heroin hidden in wax citrus. Sardine cans, statuettes of Saint Rosalia. No one could say for sure. Each Cosca, the local mafia clan, had its own dialect, its own rules. Words became weapons, sentences signals. A beginner was called a picchiotto, a kid. Killers were uomo di pancia, men with hard bellies. The highest honor was to be called a pezzo di 90, the 90 piece, a number that in Sicilian lottery law meant one thing: fear. Even names had layers. A don could be a mafia boss or a priest. A police officer might be called Zio Angelo, Uncle Angelo, a mocking term meaning guardian angel. To order a hit, a boss would name his target and spit 3 times. That was enough. In the south coast town of Favara, where Luigi Pirandello once said, the mafia would strangle a child for 3 pennies. 2 rival factions dubbed themselves Pampini, leaves, and Codi Piatti, flat tails. They squirmed under any obstacle, silent as snakes. Through it all, the question remained: could this ancient power be stopped? Perhaps not, but for the first time in decades, someone was trying to lift the veil. While Lucky Luciano waited out the end of World War II behind the walls of Great Meadow, he was suddenly confronted with a problem that reached back across decades. Vito Genovese was back in the United States, this time not as a power broker, but as a prisoner. He was facing trial in Brooklyn for the old hit on Ferdinand Boccia, the kind of unsolved mess that never stayed buried. And now, everyone was looking at Luciano for a decision. Should Vito be helped? And if so, how far should that help go? Luciano had no love left for his old lieutenant. In fact, bitterness had been simmering for years. Vito left with a bundle big enough to choke a horse, Luciano once said, disgust thick in his voice. When the war started, there were plenty of safe places a guy with money could go. But Vito, he was just rotten greedy. Through their international network, through Lisbon, through coded whispers across Europe, Luciano's crew knew exactly what Genovese was doing overseas. He had gone deep into the heroin trade. When he learned that Mussolini's son-in-law, Count Ciano, had a habit for cocaine, that was all Genovese needed. He became Ciano's personal supplier. The drugs flowed out of Turkey, arranged by Vito himself, flown in under the cover of war. Ciano once even sent his own plane to fly Genovese to Istanbul, just to make a deal. While Rommel's tanks rolled across North Africa, Vito's heroin was moving alongside them, ferried by Italian military pilots, filtered through Milanese refineries, trafficked to Tangier. Vito's world wasn't a battlefield, it was a supply chain. Joe Adonis and Buffalo's Steve Magaddino once visited Luciano in prison and brought him a letter, straight from Vito, complaining about how the Allied advance was ruining his trafficking routes. He was mad that the Americans were winning, Luciano said. His own country was beating the Nazis, and he was pissed. Luciano had already taken steps. He sent word to Frank Costello to help ensure Vito landed on his feet, if only because Luciano's own plans might require his presence in Italy after the war. He didn't trust Genovese, but he might still need him. When the Allies liberated Italy in 1944, Colonel Charles Paletti, a well-connected New York political figure and friend to the mob, was appointed as military governor. Genovese, ever the survivor, showed up at headquarters and got himself hired, on paper, as a translator. But within weeks, he wasn't interpreting English. He was running a vast black market empire. Army warehouses opened for him. US military trucks moved his goods: penicillin, cigarettes, sugar, olive oil, flour, all sold to desperate Italians at staggering markups. While GIs fought and civilians starved, Vito raked in more than $1 million in untraceable cash. To most officials, Genovese was a model citizen. Captain Charles Dunn called him absolutely honest. Major Holmgren praised him as selfless, saying he worked day and night without pay. Another officer, Major Stephen Young, called him trustworthy, loyal, dependable. Genovese had them eating out of his hand. Why not? He didn't need their money. The black market was paying him in gold. But not everyone was fooled. Sergeant Orange Dickey of the Army's Criminal Investigation Division started noticing things: missing supplies, forged signatures, Canadian soldiers moving goods under the password "Genovese sent us." Dickey followed the trail and found Genovese's name all over it. Counterintelligence had already flagged him. Some suspected he might be a Nazi collaborator or even a German spy, given his past with Mussolini's inner circle. In mid-1944, Dickey took his findings to his superiors. He was told, clearly and directly, to drop it. The operation was untouchable. Years later, Vito Genovese's fall was as loud as his rise had been quiet. By 1959, he was finally nailed, caught peddling heroin after decades of skating through murders, rackets, and corruption untouched. A syndicated columnist summed it up bluntly. He forgot the two oldest rules of the life: never mess with Uncle Sam, and never trust a dame who can talk. Genovese broke both. The dame was Anna, his estranged wife. They had married in 1930. She was no pushover. She'd once run a village club called the Caravan, and when a couple of sailors got handsy, she put them both on the floor with a bar stool. But by the late 1940s, the marriage was in shambles. In 1950, she left him and took him to court. That's when she sang. On the stand, Anna detailed Vito's empire, his lottery profits, narcotics, kickbacks, gambling income, how he was pulling in more than $40,000 a week. She named Costello, Anastasia, the whole aristocracy of organized crime. And she made sure federal investigators were listening. Once Uncle Sam got involved, it was over. The government tied Vito to an international heroin ring stretching from Europe to Cuba, Puerto Rico to Mexico. When the verdict came down, they threw the book at him. It was poetic justice. The one man who had outlasted prosecutors, rivals, and even Mussolini finally tripped over his own arrogance, and a woman with a grudge. In the words of the judge who tried him for the Boccia murder, by devious means, terrorizing witnesses, kidnapping them, even murdering them, you have thwarted justice. That was Vito Genovese, a man who got rich betraying his country, then burned by the very people he once tried to fool. In the summer of 1958, the Senate Rackets Committee was knee-deep in gangland testimony, and the name Vito Genovese once again floated to the surface. This time through the voice of a baker from Altoona, Pennsylvania, who wasn't just another small-town business owner. He was Orange Dickey, a former Army counterintelligence agent whose wartime assignment had taken him straight into the rotten core of one of the biggest black market operations in Allied-occupied Italy. Dickey appeared before the committee and calmly stated that while investigating supply thefts and illicit trades in Naples during World War II, he kept running into one name: Vito Genovese. The same Genovese who, by the 1950s, had risen to the top of the underworld hierarchy, and who just months earlier had been one of the most important delegates at the infamous Appalachian meeting. Dickey testified that Genovese was officially hired as a civilian interpreter for the Allied military government during the war, but unofficially he was the linchpin of a vast black market empire. The very goods that could have saved starving civilians and wounded soldiers penicillin, flour, olive oil, cigarettes, were being sold back to desperate Italians at extortionate prices, funneled through a network of corrupt military personnel and Sicilian loyalists. Genovese had even built a small army of American servicemen who drove the trucks, opened the warehouses, and closed their eyes. Despite his operations, Genovese had cleverly shielded himself. Captains and majors who worked with him swore he was a patriot, working long hours without pay, exposing other corrupt players. But Dickey wasn't buying it. He uncovered shipments diverted under orders signed Genovese, and Canadian soldiers who admitted that the password for moving product was Genovese sent us. The military brass eventually told Dickey to drop the investigation. He didn't. He remembered. By the time the committee grilled other underworld figures linked to Appalachian, Genovese's name was already cemented in scandal. The hearings had turned into a parade of silence, wise guys invoking the Fifth Amendment as if it were the only phrase they knew. Cleveland's John Scalish refused to answer 127 questions, including whether he was ashamed of his own wife. "An answer might incriminate me," he muttered. Joseph Profaci, the Brooklyn olive oil magnate and long-suspected mob chieftain, was no more forthcoming. Despite being fluent in English the day before, he suddenly struggled to understand even the simplest questions. "Your English was so much better yesterday," said a sarcastic Robert Kennedy. "What happened overnight?" Profaci took the fifth 92 times. When asked if he knew Luciano, Costello, Gambino, Genovese, and others, he simply refused to respond. Even the men who were talkative, like John Charles Montana, only made things worse for themselves. A respected Buffalo businessman, once named Man of the Year, Montana was caught at Appalachian and claimed he was only there to fix his brakes. His tale included faulty windshield wipers, driving 20 miles an hour in the rain, and dropping by Joe Barbara's home purely out of mechanical necessity. He claimed he didn't even know there was a meeting until he read the newspaper the next day. Senator Ives wasn't buying it. "You may be able to tell it to some people," he snapped, "but it doesn't make sense." Montana swore he had no idea who was inside the house. He claimed he told Anthony Magadino, who rode with him, that he was leaving as soon as he saw a commotion and heard someone whisper, "Roadblock." When asked why he didn't stay if he was innocent, Montana shrugged. "Maybe I should have. But I thought I'd leave too." The police had a different story. New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell, who led the Appalachian raid, testified that no cars entered the premises after 12:50 p.m., yet Montana claimed he arrived at 2 p.m. Croswell even said Montana's car wasn't outside the garage. They had parked there themselves. Later that night, the car was discovered hidden inside the garage. Despite the contradictions, Montana stood firm. He said he'd known Russell Bufalino, Charles Bufalino, and the Ciandra family from back in Italy. He spoke like a businessman, not a criminal, even as his story unraveled. Throughout it all, the committee's frustration boiled over. Witnesses dodged, lied, or stonewalled behind legal rights. When James LaDuca, a Buffalo labor figure, took the stand, he answered only 4 questions: his name, address, marital status, and birthplace. He took the fifth 77 times in 30 minutes. When asked if he was a common hoodlum, he refused to answer. When asked about phone calls to gamblers and gangsters before Appalachian, he went silent. The pattern was unmistakable. While the Justice Department insisted that progress was being made on deportations and prosecutions, the senators weren't convinced. As one put it, they no sooner get into the penitentiary than someone gets them out. Who does all this pardoning, and why? In August 1944, Sergeant Orange Dickey had seen enough. The Army brass had told him to back off. The black market scheme funneling American supplies into Italian hands was too tangled, too protected, too inconvenient to confront. But Dicky wasn't the type to play along. On his own authority, and against a tide of silence, he arrested Vito Genovese on charges of black market profiteering and possible espionage. It was one thing to slap on the cuffs. It was another to make it stick. Nobody would back him. No commanding officer would co-sign the paperwork. The army was shielding Genovese, protecting the same man who had used Allied military trucks to sell food and medicine at criminal markups. Desperate, Dicky cabled Washington. Was anyone back home even interested in Genovese? Someone was. The message reached Brooklyn, where District Attorney William "Rats" Hughes had been quietly building a murder case that had gone cold for 10 years. Inside a New York prison, a bitter mobster named Ernest the Hawk Rupolo had finally talked. He'd named Genovese in the 1934 murder of Ferdinand the Shadow Boccia, a mob hit that had been buried under layers of silence, intimidation, and payoffs. What made the difference now was Peter Latempa, a cigar store clerk and fringe underworld player, who told authorities he'd overheard the planning of the Boccia hit. It was enough for an indictment. Genovese, then working as a civilian interpreter for the Allied military government in Italy, was ordered returned to New York. Orange Dicky was assigned to bring him back. That's when Genovese made his move. "I was offered many things," Dicky later said. $250,000, jobs, favors, anything I wanted, just let him walk. When the bribes didn't work, the threats came. Genovese made it clear. Dicky's life, and his family's, was on the table. Still, Dicky wouldn't budge. He flew Genovese back to the United States in irons and handed him over to the authorities. Though technically under military jurisdiction as a civilian employee, the army relinquished custody. The pressure behind the scenes had grown too strong. A Brooklyn grand jury issued 6 murder warrants that September, including Vito Genovese, Mike Miranda, and Peter DeFeo, all heavyweight gangsters from Lower Manhattan. Also named were Gus Frasca, George Smurra, and a John Doe, known only as Solly, from Bensonhurst. The victim, Ferdinand Boccia, had made the fatal mistake of asking for his cut, $35,000, from a con the gang had run. Instead of getting paid, he was murdered in a Brooklyn cafe. Rupolo and another shooter, Rosario Palmieri, were hired to eliminate Boccia's bodyguard, Willie Gallo, just hours later. Gallo survived. Boccia didn't. The case was assigned to Assistant District Attorney Julius Helfand, and that made the New York mob nervous. Helfand wasn't their guy. Worse, Peter Latempa, their key witness, was now under protective custody, but even protective custody couldn't stop the reach of the underworld. Luciano, still locked up in Great Meadow, later recalled the moment. "You gotta realize the muscle we had with the army was pretty good, but I knew we couldn't get Vito off in a court-martial. We couldn't buy the army, so I thought, screw him, he's on his own." But then, Moretti and Frank Costello came to see me, said Anastasia, and everyone else was starting to murmur. We couldn't let Vito take a long rap. Frank figured we had to get him out of military hands and into the Brooklyn system, where we could work some angles. Anastasia got involved. Money changed hands. Access was granted. And then, quietly, inside his protective cell, Peter Latempa died. Officially, he had ulcers and gallstones. He'd been afraid to have surgery. One night, he took what he thought were pain pills. He went to sleep. He never woke up. With Latempa gone, the murder case collapsed. The corroboration vanished. Genovese sat in jail for another year, but there was nothing left to hold him on. The indictment crumbled, and the government had no choice. Vito Genovese walked. What Vito Genovese had built in Italy wasn't just a racket. It was infrastructure. Interrupted briefly by the war, those same roots began to re-emerge in the years that followed, fed by desperation, corruption, and something darker, protection from the Central Intelligence Agency. The men moving product across Sicily had no idea their street-level scores were greasing the wheels of black-budget operations. The CIA wasn't just turning a blind eye. It was quietly benefiting from the chaos, using heroin corridors as tools of influence in the Cold War's underground front. The operation took shape when the United States began deporting low-level gangsters back to Italy. These weren't bosses or consiglieri. They were soldiers, earners. Guys who'd left Palermo, Castellammare or Trapani as kids and came of age on the streets of Brooklyn, the Bronx and New Orleans. By the time they were thrown back into Sicily, they were broken, out of place, and desperate. They had forgotten the dialects, the customs, even the brutality of the old country, but they hadn't forgotten how to hustle. With no rackets of their own, they leaned into the only asset they had: American connections. And through those ties they plugged themselves into the very roots Genovese had once cultivated. Only now, that network had metastasized into something far more dangerous. These deportees weren't dealing with street crime anymore. They were fueling a global trade. Europe, unlike the United States, still allowed legal heroin production for pharmaceutical use. Labs across France and Italy, some legitimate, some fronts, masked an industrial-scale transformation of Turkish morphine base into high-grade heroin. Corsican chemists, operating out of Marseille, mastered the process and sold to anyone with cash, from the New Orleans mob to Sicilian outfits and beyond. The heroin moved through hidden compartments in cars, inside airplane cargo, or stashed deep in merchant vessels, slipping through ports with the help of dock bosses who knew which containers to flag and which to wave through. By the 1950s and into the early 1960s, Palermo was no longer just a historic city. It had become the beating heart of a narco-empire. With the CIA looking the other way, and Italy's post-fascist bureaucracy in disarray, the mafia didn't just regain control. It became the government. Judges stalled, investigations vanished, and what was once a loose collection of clans had now restructured into something more efficient, more political, and far harder to destroy. At the center of that quiet evolution was Carlo Gambino. He didn't posture like Genovese or bluster like Anastasia. He operated with patience, precision. Palermo was his birthplace, and it had now become his power base, not in title, but in reach. Where Genovese had broken ground, Gambino and his closest ally, Tommy Lucchese, built the structure. They funneled heroin through a loosely organized network of Sicilian clans. Men with no official titles, no paper trail, but total control over the ports, the labs, and the local enforcement. By the 1960s, the Corsicans were slipping. Product purity was down. Routes were compromised. And the Sicilians, without fanfare, took over. What Gambino saw in Palermo wasn't just the future of the heroin trade. It was a return to first principles. The city had become a borderless hub, a place where old-world omertà met Cold War pragmatism, and the line between state power and criminal enterprise blurred beyond recognition. Behind the facade of politics, heroin had become the real currency of Sicily, and it flowed through hands that answered no government. In the early 1960s, while European and American newspapers warned of a revival of the Black Hand, Italian politicians could no longer pretend the mafia was dying. It had evolved. Mussolini had failed to wipe it out, and the Americans had unknowingly fertilized its return by toppling fascism and leaving a vacuum of power. Into that void stepped men like Genco Russo, and from across the Atlantic, Gambino. They weren't racketeers anymore. They were kingmakers. What made this transformation so lethal was its subtlety. Gone were the vendetta killings in the piazza. Instead, favors were exchanged over coffee. Officials accumulated suspicious wealth. Containers were waved through customs. A city once ruled by feudal lords now bowed to a new class of shadow brokers, mafia bosses who owned the land, the law, and the logistics. Gambino never made headlines in Palermo, but his reach, his vision, was everywhere. Through blood relatives still living in the hills and American emissaries tied to the port unions and airport crews, he helped refine the old Genovese blueprint into something sustainable. Morphine came in from Turkey. It was refined in Sicilian labs hidden behind fake storefronts and quiet pharmacies. From there, Gambino's shipping channels took over, routes through Naples, Genoa, even Marseille, all landing cleanly in the American cities already wired for distribution. By the time Italian newspapers began admitting what law enforcement had long suspected, that the mafia controlled tax offices, land registries, and entire elections, Gambino's network had already baked itself into the political architecture. In the United States, his influence protected him from meaningful prosecution. In Italy, his name barely surfaced, but his fingerprints were on every stage of the heroin trade. The Corsicans had cracked the formula. The Sicilians perfected the business. And Gambino owned the future. To the outside world, it looked like the mafia had returned. But to those inside, it had never left. It had just taken off its old uniform and put on a tie. During 1942 and 1943, Meyer Lansky stayed planted in New York. No runs to Florida, no flights to Havana. His time was spoken for by the United States Navy. He didn't wear a uniform, but he was deep in it. Intelligence work, sabotage prevention, a different kind of war effort. One night, he got a message from an old Italian contact, nervous, urgent. The guy wouldn't talk to anyone else, only Lansky. He was terrified his intel would end up in the wrong hands. Maybe in front of a pro-Mussolini sympathizer inside the mob. If that happened, he was a dead man. They met in a restaurant, but the man refused to speak. "Let's walk," he said. So they strolled the streets, two shadows moving through the dark, while the man told his story. His brother was a fisherman. The night before, he'd been out past Long Island, doing something he shouldn't have been doing. Lansky never asked. He didn't care. What mattered was what the man saw. Out of the black ocean, a submarine surfaced. Dead quiet. Then a rubber boat came out of its belly. 4 men and 2 sailors loaded it up with suitcases and oars wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. They rowed ashore. The 4 men walked up the beach, and the sailors went back. The hatch closed. The sub disappeared. Lansky took the story straight to Commander Charles Haffenden, his contact in naval intelligence. "I gave him the coordinates, the timing," Lansky said. No names, no details about the fisherman's hustle. Just what mattered. A short time later, J. Edgar Hoover announced the capture of 8 Nazi saboteurs. 4 had come ashore, right where Lansky's informant had said. Their mission was destruction. Factories, bridges, ships. The real deal. "Haffenden showed me a button," Lansky said, his voice flat. "Came off one of the Germans. He picked it up on the beach. Kept it like a souvenir." That wasn't the end of Lansky's wartime career. Not even close. He turned his attention to the German-American Bund, particularly Fritz Kuhn and his crowd in Yorkville. Lansky sent men in disguised as waiters. Restaurants full of Nazi sympathizers became feeding grounds for intelligence, and the Navy played along. Some of the vending machine cash was collected by Navy officers, Lansky said. They delivered it right into our hands. Never took a dime. That may be the only time the Navy collected for the mafia. Then there was Senator Walsh, caught in a mess tied to a brothel and suspected Nazi blackmail. Some of Mikey's boys helped the Navy set up surveillance. They staked the place out, watching everyone going in and out. We knew who to follow, who to question. Lansky also kept the Port of New York running smooth. No sabotage, no strikes. Nothing went wrong after Lucky Luciano gave the order. "We locked it down," Lansky said. No funny business on the docks. No leaks. The ships kept moving. But the Navy wanted more. They were planning for Sicily. Commander Haffenden invited Lansky to dinner and dropped it on him. "We're going to Europe," he said. Lansky was stunned. "I don't know how I can help you invade Europe," he said. But Haffenden had an idea. Sicilian Americans. People with family photos, postcards, old memories of the terrain, anything that could help paint a picture of the landing zones. He wanted Lansky to find them. So Lansky did. Word spread through the community. Navy headquarters in New York was flooded with Sicilians carrying family albums and half-remembered details of the old country. Some didn't speak a word of English, but they talked about villages, roads, bridges, the texture of sand, the currents off the coast, everything. Haffenden was under pressure. He looked worse every day, bags under his eyes, weight dropping. "They're screaming for more," he told Lansky. "The lives of American boys are on the line." Lansky leaned on Joe Adonis. "We need more people," he told him. Joe laughed, but he showed up. "The commander's aides knew all about him," Lansky said. "One of them rattled off his arrest sheet like a grocery list." Joe just smiled. "You ever put me in prison?" he asked. "Didn't think so." Adonis got to work. He found old sailors in Brooklyn. He brought in Vincenzo Nangano, an import-export guy who was also the key link between the American mafia and the Sicilian bosses. Nangano opened up his entire network. As Sicily got closer, Haffenden's office turned into something between a war room and a neighborhood club. Maps everywhere, postcards pinned to walls, old men describing coastlines from memory. Lucky had an idea too. "He wanted to parachute into Sicily," Lansky said, cracking a smile. "He thought he could go in with the first wave, be a scout. Said he was willing to die to help. I told Haffenden, half serious. What about the most famous Sicilian of them all? Drop Lucky in there." He didn't go for it. Washington didn't want to be seen using gangsters. They wanted the intel, but not the headlines. Judge McCook denied Lucky's bid for clemency, but he left the door open for executive pardon. Lansky gave it to him straight. "Sit tight. They're giving you a chance. You stop helping now, you're done. Don't act like a schmuck." Luciano listened. He kept helping. Lansky remembered hearing the news on the radio. The Allies had landed in Sicily. "I knew we had helped make that happen." Commander Haffenden later told him what it looked like on the ground. 4 officers who'd worked the New York intelligence circles, Titolo, Alfieri, Marslow, Murray, hit the beaches at Gela and Licata with the first wave. They carried maps drawn with help from Lansky's volunteers. They knew who to see, which families to find. The locals helped them dodge mines and bypass strongholds. Mafia and Luciano were passwords, Lansky said. People smiled. That was enough. Alfieri scored a major hit thanks to a man Lucky had once saved from the electric chair. The guy had shot a cop as a kid and was shipped off to Sicily under Luciano's orders. He'd become a mafia leader there, and now, during the war, he was critical. He led Alfieri to the Italian Navy's secret command post. His crew killed the guards. Alfieri blew open a safe and walked out with files that detailed the entire German and Italian defense network, codes, minefields, the whole layout. That intelligence accelerated Italy's surrender. Alfieri got the Legion of Merit. The Mafia also helped bring the ports back online after the fighting. They told the Allies who could be trusted and who was a fascist holdover. But when the dust settled, the same men who helped win the war turned to the black market. Old habits. New opportunities. The Mafia went back to making money fraud, stolen penicillin, whatever the market wanted. Washington didn't like how things had gone. Naval intelligence sent in a review team. Dozens of Sicilian American agents were reassigned. Officially, the mafia angle never happened. But the truth stuck to Lansky like smoke. "The Navy burned the records," he said. "They shut everyone up. Commander Haffenden got the message. Keep your mouth shut or face a court-martial." Lansky was livid. "They used us. Then they erased us. They called us criminals when it suited them, patriots when it didn't." Before Haffenden died, he pulled Lansky aside at a wedding. "They're going to deny all of it," he said. "A senior officer told me, and I quote, 'I'm not giving credit to any Jew son of a bitch.' That's the cover-up." Polakov, Lansky's attorney, fought to get Luciano recognition. He told the parole board that Lansky had worked for free. "Nothing to gain," he said, "just served his country." But naval intelligence wouldn't back it. The silence was deafening. Lansky, fed up, went straight to parole officer Healy. He laid it all out, everything from that first meeting with Haffenden at the Astor Hotel in April 1942 to the final insult. They had fought a secret war for America, and now the country wanted to forget them. It wasn't the last time these men would serve their country. In truth, they weren't just serving the United States. They were serving themselves. The wartime alliance had always carried a price tag. Luciano's freedom was the goal, and every favor, every scrap of intelligence pushed him a step closer to it. But as the war ended and the American flag started flying higher around the world, the rules changed. The elite, politicians, spy masters, businessmen, realized that the tools they'd used to win a war could help them run an empire. Military assets, intelligence services, organized crime, it all blended into one machine of control. Whether it was securing contracts for the United Fruit Company, setting up a money pipeline through Lansky's Cuban casinos, or pulling the strings in Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, and the Bahamas, the United States had found its formula. Naval intelligence and the old OSS didn't disappear. They evolved into the Central Intelligence Agency. And the men who ran those wartime back channels stuck around. Paul Helliwell, Alan Dulles, Tom Dewey. Quiet faces in high offices, making quiet deals with the very criminals they once claimed to pursue. Lansky, Lucchese, Gambino, Anastasia, Costello, Luciano. The lines blurred, the handshakes sealed. The war had ended. The partnership had just begun. The SS Laura Keene wasn't built for beauty. She was one of 1,000 Liberty ships thrown together in the desperate churn of war, fast, functional, and doomed to rust once peace came. But in early 1946, battered and barnacled, she was given a final assignment. No longer hauling tanks or troops, she was now a vessel of quiet exodus, bringing home soldiers from Europe and carrying out the unwanted. Among them, the most infamous gangster America had ever produced. On the morning of February 9, 1946, the Laura Keene sat docked at Pier 7, Bush Terminal, Brooklyn. The icy wind off the harbor cut through the city like a knife. At noon, she would sail for Genoa, Italy, with Charles Lucky. Luciano, locked away inside, exiled from the country he had once helped rule from the shadows. The press was promised a statement, a press conference maybe, but when they arrived, there was nothing. No quotes, no photos, no access. Luciano refused to speak. Legally, he was still a federal prisoner until the ship passed the 3-mile limit, and his silence was final. When reporters tried to reach the ship, they were met with sharpened bailing hooks and thick shoulders. A human wall of longshoremen had been posted to guard the pier, hand-picked and posted by Albert Anastasia and his brother, Tough Tony Anastasio. When journalists appealed to District Attorney Frank Hogan's men on the scene, they were politely told to get lost. One by one, Long black limousines slid through the barricade, their windows drawn. The press stood outside, freezing, watching as the morning slipped away. At exactly noon, the ship creaked loose from the dock and began her slow crawl toward the Atlantic. What happened on board was left to whispers. Days before departure, Luciano had been visited at Ellis Island by Polakov, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello. They came to say goodbye, but also to plan. They promised a farewell party on board. "Friends are coming from all over," they told him. "You need anything?" Charlie grinned. "Bart already brought my clothes. Some still fit, tight from all the good food in Great Meadow. But maybe send over a few newer suits from Size Place, one size up. I'll drop the weight on the boat." And cash. He needed cash. The fortune he'd built was mostly gone, burned up in legal bills, appeals, and bribes. $1 million gone before he ever left the courtroom. Another $1 million to keep the machine running while he sat in prison. Still, a story was already circulating. Lucky Luciano, sailing off with a trunk stuffed with $40 million. He never denied it. "Let the Italians think I'm a millionaire," he said. "They respect money." Lansky promised him enough to get started again. "Don't worry," he said. "Everybody's bringing something to the party. You'll have more than enough." And then there was the matter of company for the voyage. Luciano asked about girls. Gay Orlova, his Russian flame, had tried, but red tape kept her stateside. "Don't worry," Lansky laughed. "We handled it. 3 showgirls are coming along. They'll stop in Paris on the way back." Luciano winced. "If you picked 'em, Meyer, I'm in trouble." Meyer wasn't known for his taste in women. Costello cracked up. "Relax. We gave the job to Joe Adonis. He's got the Copa girls." Luciano nodded. "If Joe picked 'em, we're all right." The send-off was a mobster's dream. Crates of champagne, hampers from Fulton Fish Market, kosher spreads, seafood, pasta, wine. They ate like kings. The longshoremen kept the press away, their bailing hooks glinting in the harbour light. Luciano's closest friends, Lansky, Costello, Adonis, moved freely, hugging him, slipping him envelopes, whispering futures into his ear. What wasn't said out loud, but very much arranged, was the division of Luciano's empire. Costello would handle all American gambling, except for Miami, Havana, and the planned casinos in the Bahamas, which fell under Lansky's control. Lucchese, Scalise, Torrio, Adonis, they all got pieces. The organization would keep running. Luciano would rule in absentia. But not everything sat right. "One thing bugged me," he later admitted. "They were cutting me out of all the legit businesses, stuff that started during the war. I didn't talk about it. Not to nobody but Meyer. I needed him for what came next. And I needed to see if he was still really on my side." The exile had been arranged quickly. On January 4th, 1946, inmate number 15,684 at Great Meadow was notified. Governor Tom Dewey had granted a special commutation. Luciano was moved to Sing Sing, then, quietly, to Ellis Island. Dewey later admitted it was payback. "His help with the Navy was extensive and valuable," Dewey said, "and 10 years is a long time for compulsory prostitution. Plus, he'd be gone, exiled forever." Costello was with his lawyer, his oldest confidant and one of the few people he still trusted, was staring at him with that same look he always gave when things were about to go sideways. "You shouldn't be going, Frank," the lawyer said, voice low and urgent. Frank Costello didn't answer right away. He knew what was waiting for him down at Pier 7. Cameras, reporters, tabloid sharks with ink-stained claws. But he also knew who was leaving. Lucky Luciano, his friend, his brother in everything that counted. "You don't understand," Frank finally said. "I have to go. I gotta say goodbye." At that very moment, Luciano was preparing for his departure, unaware that the quiet gathering at his sidemen he thought he could trust would one by one prove to be a disappointment. They were already smiling in his face and planning their own moves behind his back. "You can't go down there, Frank," George said again. "I won't allow it." "I got to go," Frank replied. "It's the right thing." Luciano was sailing the next morning, February 9th, 1946, from the Bush terminal in Brooklyn. He wasn't just leaving the country. He was being exiled, and Frank Costello wasn't going to let him leave like that, not without looking him in the eye one last time. "Every reporter and photographer in New York is going to be there," George warned. "You'll be the #1 target. Do you think they're going to ignore the guy they call the Prime Minister of the underworld? You show up at that pier and it's front page by morning." Frank lit a cigarette, calm as ever. "He was my friend," he said. "What's so wrong about paying a little visit to the boat when he leaves? You're blowing this way out of proportion." George leaned in. "For 3 years we've been trying to clean up your image, but every time they point at your friends, Luciano, Adonis, Anastasia. You think tomorrow's going to help that?" Frank cracked a small smile, amused. "What's going to happen?" he asked. "You'll be standing in the middle of what looks like a convention of America's top mob bosses, and there you'll be, in every photo, every headline. You'll make it easy for them." Frank paused, let the smoke drift out of his nose. Then he said it, soft, final. "There's only one thing you don't know, George." "What's that?" "I got to go." Lansky remembered how fast it happened. "I wanted to see him at Great Meadow, but by the time I got there he was already moved. I met Frank at Moore's restaurant. We made the plan for the send-off. We needed it quietly. Too much attention, and someone in Washington might change their mind." They met Luciano in isolation on Ellis Island. Lansky, Costello, Polakov, Mikey Lascari. Special passes. A lot of hugging. A lot of old memories. Lansky remembered the ferry ride. "It felt strange, like going back in time. I came through there with my mother. I almost cried." On February 8th, the day before departure, they arrived at Pier 7. The ship was ready. The longshoremen were in place. Everything was locked down. And inside, the Last Supper, wine, fish, showgirls, old friends. The ship that once carried war supplies now held the ghosts of an empire, gangsters from every coast who came to pay homage to their king. No one stopped them. The Navy didn't interfere. The port authorities looked the other way. The gangsters ate, laughed, toasted, and said goodbye. And as the Laura Keene pulled away, wrapped in wind and silence, the last faces Luciano saw were not guards or reporters, but the men he built an empire with, and the few he still dared to trust. That cold February day, as the Laura Keene was docked at Brooklyn's Pier 7, Luciano's empire was already being divvied up. Everything had been arranged. Frank Costello was handed the keys to the American gambling scene. Everything except Miami, Havana, and the soon-to-be-built casino playgrounds in the Bahamas. That territory was Lansky's. Lucchese, Adonis, Scalise, Torrio. They took over other rackets. The machine kept humming, but Luciano saw the angles. He didn't say much at the time. Not to them. But, deep down, it festered. In his words, "I was being cut out of all the legit business my so-called friends were getting into during and after the war." While Luciano was being sent packing, Carlo Gambino was getting rich. World War II had been the best thing that ever happened to him. The deportation proceedings against him went cold, buried under the fog of war. And on the streets, Gambino moved with quiet precision. Bootlegging had made him a force during Prohibition, but the black market of the 1940s made him a millionaire. Ration stamps, gasoline, meat, sugar had become currency. Gambino partnered with his brother Paul and New Jersey mob heavyweight Settimo Big Sam Accardi to build an operation that cornered the market. At first, they sent burglars into federal vaults to crack safes and steal ration coupons straight from the Office of Price Administration. Later, they skipped the drama and bought them directly from corrupt officials. It was smoother, safer, the stamps were authentic, and they sold millions of them on the street, being careful never to flood the market. When the ration stamps became a money-maker, Joe Valachi later told the Senate, Carlo was one of the richest guys in the game. Sam told me they made over $1 million on one deal alone. I made about $150,000 myself. But ration stamps were just the start. Valachi, who knew the streets better than any Fed, put it simply, Gambino's been in every kind of business, shylocking, Italian numbers, butcher shops, everything except maybe the Pope's business. When asked if Gambino ever ran legitimate companies, Valachi shrugged. Not that I know of. But the truth was, Gambino knew legitimate business inside and out. He made a fortune investing the dirty money, meat markets, bakeries, nightclubs, fruit stands, olive oil distributors, pizzerias, paper products, fuel companies. The garbage game? He owned it. Investigators later found he controlled garbage routes across every borough in New York, plus Long Island, Westchester, and into New Jersey. When other crews tried to get a slice, they either got pushed out or disappeared into one of his junkyards, and Carlo never put his name on anything. His fingerprints were invisible. Businesses were in the names of brothers, cousins, like the Castellanos, or clean associates with no criminal records. Carlo only held on to the money machines. The shaky outfits were squeezed dry and dumped into bankruptcy with a stack of unpayable invoices. Take Murray Meatpacking, a company in trouble. They borrowed from a loan shark, couldn't pay, and soon acquired a new partner, one of Gambino's relatives. He drained them for $175,000 before leaving them to rot. Then there was SGS Associates, a labor relations firm, where Gambino actually let his name appear. Gold lettering on a door at 141 East 44th Street. His partners, a convicted burglar and a Russian mystery man. Their client list was powerful. Wellington Associates, owners of the Chrysler Building, Flower and Fifth Avenue Hospital, Bond Clothes, the Concord Hotel. The firm earned a cool $500,000 a year. Some companies paid just to avoid union trouble. Others found that strikes settled themselves soon after hiring SGS. The firm folded under the weight of federal investigations in 1965. It was the last time Gambino's name was ever seen on an office door. But he never stopped working both ends of the labor racket, taking cuts from contractors, dipping into union dues, shaking down both bosses and reps. His people burrowed deep into the Teamsters, the ILA, and the city's billion-dollar construction trades. He skimmed from John F. Kennedy Airport. Even the cutlery grinding industry wasn't safe. His brother Paul opened a sham grinding company and gutted the competition, costing the New York Grinders Association over $500,000 in business. At one point, he offered to walk away for $300,000. They refused. He settled for $175,000, threw in some worthless machinery, and moved on. The message was clear. In New York, even knives were part of the business. Luciano knew all about this and was fuming. The gambling and vice he built was still under his name, but the new empire, legit, corporate, connected, that was slipping through his fingers. So, on his final day at Ellis Island, Luciano pulled Lansky aside for a private meet. Just the two of them. No Costello, no Adonis. He told Meyer the part no one else knew. He had already used his real name, Salvatore Lucania, to secure travel documents, not just for Italy, but for Cuba, Mexico, and most of South America. The plan was simple. 6 months to lie low, get his bearings, and rebuild personal connections without fronts. And if he couldn't get back into the States? "I'll become a Cuban citizen," he said. "Take back control from there." He also asked Lansky to arrange a meeting, a real one. Not a dinner, not a phone call. He wanted every major boss present, every family, everyone on the Unione Council. He proposed the end of 1946, somewhere warm, somewhere off the radar. Havana, he said, Christmas time, disguised as a holiday getaway. But it wasn't just about optics. Havana was booming. The war was over. The tourists were coming back. The gambling was hot. The women were hotter. Lansky and Batista were already printing money. I had no intention of being left out of that, Luciano said. Ramon Grau San Martin was now president, but Batista still pulled the strings, and Lansky had Batista in his pocket. Luciano knew it. So did Lansky. I let Meyer in on the whole thing, he said, and it was a test, to see if he was still really on my side, because if it worked, I was going to shrink the 4,000-mile leash Dewey tried to put on me down to 90 miles from Miami. And Lansky? He didn't flinch. He understood exactly what Charlie was planning, and he started making the calls. There was still one piece left for Charlie Luciano to settle before he was pushed out of the country for good. From his locked-down meetings on Ellis Island, where the Bureau of Immigration kept him under watch, Luciano summoned the last men he trusted, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Tommy Lucchese, and Albert Anastasia. I was already pissed off, Luciano later told them. Here I was getting tossed out of the States for something I never did, while I'd been busting my ass trying to keep that little bastard Vito Genovese from getting clipped, and now he's about to walk free like nothing happened. The issue was bigger than just Vito's release. Luciano reminded them all of something he hadn't forgotten. You remember what he did back in 43, when Mussolini was still riding high? That scumbag Vito was busy making friends with the fascists. There was this newspaper guy in New York, Carlo Tresca. He hated Mussolini, and he made sure everyone knew it. I wrote about it in every edition of Il Martello. It drove Il Duce nuts. So, what does Vito do? He promises Mussolini he'll shut the guy up, for good. According to Luciano, Genovese sent word from Italy, and a contract was passed to Tony Bender. Tresca was gunned down on Lower Fifth Avenue, broad daylight, shotgunned in the back as he stepped out of his car. Old school hit, Luciano said. And I swore to myself right then, when I was locked up in Great Meadow, I was going to have a talk with both those guys, Vito and Bender. They broke the Unione rule. Nobody gets hit on American soil without a vote. No exceptions. The press played it differently. Carlo Tresca's murder lit up every anti-fascist circle in New York. Ezio Taddei, one of Tresca's closest allies, stood before a packed house at the Rand School and laid it out in plain terms. The authorities were shielding the real killer. He had documents tracing the threats against Tresca back to 1934. He said Tresca lived in constant fear, that a mob-connected gang with deep financial ties had been trying to silence him for years. A few months before the murder, Tresca publicly clashed with one of those gangsters at a banquet in Manhattan. Days before he was killed, someone tried to run him down in front of the new school. That same car, Taddei claimed, was seen with Carmine Galante behind the wheel the day of the murder. Galante was eventually picked up in connection to the hit. But Taddei made it clear Galante was just the button man. The real story was about who gave the order. Taddei claimed Galante worked for a dummy trucking firm, paid to do nothing, and he demanded to know who was behind the payroll. He all but named Vito Genovese. The press tried to muddy the waters, floating communist conspiracies. But Taddei, no communist himself, warned the public not to fall for the smear campaign. Silence your politics, he told the crowd. You want the truth? Look at who had a reason to want Tresca dead. Then look at who had the power to keep the investigation quiet. None of this changed the fact that Genovese beat the rap. In July 1946, after years of legal wrangling, the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office quietly admitted it had no case. Vito walked out, free. Luciano saw a storm coming. I told Tommy and Albert, once he's out he's going to go back to work. Same setup, same routes. But the second he steps out of line, I want to hear about it. Fast. If he breathes wrong, I want somebody to tell me. What Luciano didn't count on was Vito's paranoia. Once out, Genovese started to believe every whisper in the street. He thought Luciano was running his narco empire and calling shots from Italy, that the stories about Luciano running Europe's black market, especially the narcotics traffic, were real. He started seeing a conspiracy. To Vito, Luciano had built an empire while deliberately keeping him out. And to some extent, it was true. The post-war black market was booming, worth more than prohibition ever was. Drugs, weapons, stolen goods, everything flowed across borders shattered by war. Narcotics, in particular, became the new gold rush. But Luciano wasn't the only player. The Corsican mafia was in deep, funneling heroin through Marseille, with protection from French intelligence. The Central Intelligence Agency had its own interests, looking the other way, or even facilitating certain routes, in the name of Cold War operations. In Sicily, exiles like Silver Dollar Sam were helping move product. Luciano may have opened the door, but others were now walking through it. Vito wasn't buying that. He saw betrayal in every corner. He started building his own alliances, quiet at first, then open. He drew close to men like Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, even Carmine Galante. Joe Bonanno saw the shift. He played both sides, friendly to Vito on the surface, but smart enough to see an opportunity. By allowing Galante to work with Genovese in building a heroin empire, Bonanno figured he could fracture the Luciano family from within. Luciano's deportation had left a vacuum, and Bonanno knew how to fill one. Others followed. Tommy Eboli got involved. Then Tommy Lucchese. Even Carlo Gambino, always careful, began moving closer to the narcotics trade. The money was too big to ignore. Prohibition had sparked bloodshed, but narcotics promised 10 times the profit, and none of the public outrage. Everyone knew it was getting out of hand. But nobody wanted to be the one to step away from the table. Luciano, watching it all unfold from Naples, could feel the grip slipping. With Willie Moretti dead, Joe Adonis deported, and Costello under fire, the men he once trusted were falling. His influence, once felt in every room from Havana to Harlem, was fading. And Vito Genovese, the man he had once helped, was now standing at the edge of the empire, ready to take it for himself. By the morning of February 9th, 1946, everything was in place. Charlie Luciano, dressed sharp and moving like a man who still ran things, boarded the Laura Keene as if he were heading to a private resort, not a deportation. His cabin was already stocked with a new wardrobe, delivered ahead of time. 3 hand-picked girls, arranged by Joe Adonis with help from Virginia Hill, who now belonged to Bugsy Siegel, were waiting in adjoining rooms. The tables inside his quarters looked like a banquet hall. Delicatessen spreads, roast beef, turkeys, pasta, magnums of champagne, Italian wines, the top-shelf liquor. But the real show was happening on deck. Luciano's send-off wasn't quiet. It was a roll call of American organized crime. Meyer Lansky was there. So was Frank Costello. Bugsy Siegel flew in from California. Willie Moretti and Longy Zwillman came from Jersey. Tommy Lucchese, Joe Adonis, Joe Bonanno, Albert Anastasia, Steve Magadino, Russell Bufalino from Buffalo. The list didn't stop. With Anastasia came Carlo Gambino, who by now had become a rising force in Brooklyn, thanks to wartime black market scams involving gasoline and food ration stamps. Gambino wasn't flashy, but everyone knew he was moving up. It was less a farewell and more a coronation. Even the political world made an appearance, quietly. Luciano had helped elect more than 80 politicians during his time at the top. A few came in person. The others sent representatives. Luciano put it bluntly. The least they could do was drink a glass of champagne and wish me a good sailing. Anastasia's crew kept the press at arm's length, close enough to let them know something was happening, but too far for any usable photos. It was Luciano's way of throwing them a bone for showing up without letting them get a headline. The mood was light. Nobody thought it was permanent. This wasn't exile. It was a vacation. A short break. He'd be back. Everyone believed it. Then the pilot horn blew, and just like that, the mood changed. The Laura Keane pulled away, cutting across the harbour toward the Atlantic, and the goodbyes ended. Luciano stood alone on the deck, the cold February wind cutting through his coat. The Manhattan skyline slipped past. The Statue of Liberty loomed to his right. I tried to tell myself it was just a vacation, he later said, that the lady would be saying hello instead of goodbye next time I saw her. But he knew. You could hear it in the horn, feel it in your gut. Down below, 3 girls were already half drunk, throwing their own party. 15 other deportees were on board, but Luciano didn't know most of them. The party upstairs was over, and the further the ship got from shore, the more alone he felt. Then he noticed he wasn't completely alone. 2 men were leaning on the rail behind him, silent, watching. One turned out to be from immigration, just there to make sure he didn't try diving overboard until they were deep enough at sea. The other one, Luciano wouldn't find out who he was until half an hour later. Just when the Laura Keane was finding its rhythm out of the harbour, the ship suddenly slowed. There was a burst of movement on the water fireboat pulling up alongside, throwing a small wake as it drifted close. Then someone in a long, expensive overcoat with a velvet collar scrambled up the boarding ladder. It wasn't a Fed. It wasn't another deportee. It was Bill O'Dwyer, the mayor of New York City. He didn't waste time with protocol. He walked straight up to Luciano, threw an arm around his shoulder and nodded toward the man walking ahead of them. Charlie, he said, this is Murray Weinstein, one of my personal men. He's on Captain Balz's staff downtown. He'll make sure nobody bothers you. Then he got serious. I made a personal guarantee you wouldn't pull anything, so the immigration man's getting off with me. Please, don't make me look bad, Charlie. Luciano nodded. Don't worry about nothing, Bill. I appreciate you coming out here personally. O'Dwyer didn't flinch. Charlie, I owe you everything I got. Along with a lot of apologies we don't need to talk about anymore. You know I couldn't show my face at Bush Terminal, but I wasn't going to let you sail off without shaking your hand. It hit Luciano harder than he expected. He wanted to say something but couldn't. He just stood there. Finally, O'Dwyer gave him a hard slap on the back and muttered, Arrivederci, in a butchered Irish-Italian accent. Luciano laughed. That's when I almost lost it. It was like saying goodbye to the last piece of what I built. But the irony wasn't lost on anyone who paid attention. This was the same Bill O'Dwyer who would soon find himself testifying in front of Senator Estes Kefauver. The same O'Dwyer who couldn't remember the names of the racketeers he had once courted, couldn't recall the details of how Relis, the canary who knew too much, fell from a Coney Island hotel window while under police guard. He couldn't explain why Vito Genovese beat a murder charge. He couldn't remember the political favors, the backroom meetings, the timing of when Luciano was released in exchange for wartime cooperation. He forgot a lot, but everyone else remembered. By the early 1950s, O'Dwyer had been shuffled off to Mexico, an ambassador now, not a mayor. The same Mexico Luciano had been eyeing as a fallback if Havana didn't hold. The same place Silver Dollar Sam had disappeared into after his deportation. The same place where deals still got made, just with new actors and different masks. That handshake aboard the Laura Keane was more than a goodbye. It was a quiet trade-off between 2 men who had run the city from different ends. And it was the last favor O'Dwyer would ever do Luciano. Then it was done. The fireboat peeled away, the skyline faded, and the Laura Keene pushed past the 3-mile limit. I looked around, Luciano later said, and I was surrounded by nothing but water. The skyline was gone. There wasn't nothing left to see but ocean, no matter where I stood on that boat. That was when it finally hit him. I was really on my way back to Italy, and I didn't like it one bit. Charlie Luciano wasn't the only mob boss marked for deportation that year. In fact, he was just the beginning. By spring, another figure, equally feared, arguably more entrenched in Southern blood politics, was forced out of the country. This time, it wasn't New York. It was New Orleans. The man in question was Silvestro Carollo, known on the streets as Silver Dollar Sam. He'd held a grip on the Crescent City so tight that even federal agents admitted the local police were scared to look him in the eye. Before he was deported, Carollo made sure the throne stayed warm. He handed control to a younger, colder operator, Carlos Marcello, who would take the same political and criminal connections Carollo had built and push them deeper into the fabric of American industry. Carollo's reign wasn't just about gambling and vice. It was about absolute control. Narcotics agents wound up dead. Cops were shot in broad daylight. A chain of shootings ripped through New Orleans, and every trail pointed back to Silver Dollar Sam. The authorities, pressured by Washington and scandal fatigue, finally acted. Just like Luciano, Carollo was loaded onto a plane and sent to Italy. But unlike Luciano, he didn't stay there. Carollo bounced from Italy to Mexico, then quietly slipped back into the United States. By 1950, the feds caught up with him again and tossed him out. For good this time, or so they thought. From exile, Carollo reinvented himself. He forged ties with the Corsican underworld in Europe, men moving heroin through Marseille with protection from French intelligence, and linked them to smuggling routes through Mexico. Those same routes fed directly into the New Orleans Mafia, now under Marcello's leadership. Carollo became a pipeline of power from Sicily to the American South, and even from across the ocean, he kept pulling levers. He was deported again in 1950, but deportation didn't mean disappearance. In 1966, after rumblings of tension between his son and Marcello, Carollo made another return, this time with blood on his mind. Back in 1930, when the city still pretended to be shocked by gangland killings, the press printed his name without fear. On a cold night in December, a criminal named William Bailey was gunned down with a shotgun as he pulled up to his car outside a house on Governor Nicholas Street. Witnesses said it was a textbook hit. Bailey didn't die right away. At the hospital, he managed to get a name out: Silvestro Carollo. Within hours, Carollo was arrested. Bailey's murder was linked to hijackings, likely retaliation for stepping on Carollo's bootlegging turf. Police said 4 men were involved, but it was Carollo they wanted. Weeks later, a raid on a pool room on St. Mary Street uncovered a small arsenal. 5 revolvers, a sawed-off automatic shotgun. The Dallau brothers, Anthony and George, were caught with the stash. One of the pistols had been fired 6 times. The shotgun still had 2 live shells, matching those found at the 3rd District branch of the Whitney Bank during a New Year's Eve robbery that had left 2 men dead and 2 others wounded. Behind the pool room wall, hidden by a loose plank, was everything they needed to connect a massacre to the city's underground. That arsenal belonged to someone, and every detective knew whose fingerprints were metaphorically on the trigger. In February 1932, the federal government opened up a wider lens. 104 indictments dropped on what they called an international ring, a bootlegging syndicate that stretched from Vancouver to Belize to the Louisiana-Mississippi Gulf Coast. Federal agents claimed the operation was directed by none other than Al Capone himself. But in New Orleans, the local arm of the empire had 2 names on it: Silvestro Carollo and Frank Todaro. The indictment read like a census of the underworld. Bootleggers, rum runners, deputies turned traffickers, millionaire distillers, political bagmen. The operation shipped Canadian liquor through British Honduras, relayed it by sea into the swamps of Louisiana, and moved it north in armed convoys. The syndicate owned its own radio station, its own fleet of trucks, even its own ships. Witnesses claimed that Ted Newbury, one of Capone's lieutenants, supervised offloading in the Gulf. Workers in Mississippi were told this syndicate had protection from big money and from law enforcement. Among the accused, the Bronfmans of Montreal, multiple Vancouver companies, and dozens of men from Kiln, Mississippi, a town that looked quiet from the road but had its own mafia payroll. There were New York men, Chicago men, locals, deputies, merchants, bankers, and there was Carollo, again, indicted, involved, connected. Even after prison and deportation, Carollo's imprint didn't fade. His name kept showing up on federal paperwork. And when the winds changed in New Orleans, when factions began to shift and the Marcello family found itself pulled in different directions, the ghost of Silver Dollar, Sam returned, not to make peace, but to remind them who built the empire in the first place. By early 1932, the noose around Silvestro Carollo was tightening. His name, alongside Frank Todaro's, was stamped on a sweeping federal indictment that named 118 individuals in what the press called an international bootlegging conspiracy. The ink was still drying on the grand jury's paperwork in New Orleans when two of the key figures, Carollo and Todaro, were discovered serving time inside the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. The message from Washington was clear. Their freedom wasn't going to mean escape. As soon as their sentences ran out, the government would be waiting, with fresh charges and new leverage. But prison wasn't enough to dull Carollo's political instincts. He was playing a longer game, and the next time his name hit headlines, it wasn't for bootlegging or murder. It was for almost beating deportation with a signature. In 1946, a quiet move was made behind the scenes. Carollo, now an ex-con with federal time, state time, and a record that stretched back to 1923, was trying to block deportation again. He had the right lawyer, and the lawyer had the right connection. That connection was Congressman James Morrison of Hammond, Louisiana, who introduced a private bill in Congress that would have made Carollo a naturalized citizen just by having him swear the oath. That one line of legislation would have pulled the rug out from under immigration and turned Carollo's deportation into a dead file. But New Orleans had changed since the early 30s. The local press caught wind of the deal, and the public backlash was immediate. Carollo's record wasn't hidden, it was public and well documented. He'd shot 2 men, one of them a federal agent. He was tied to narcotics and served time not just in Atlanta, but also in Angola, the infamous Louisiana State Penitentiary. Yet a bill was now sitting in Washington that would have handed him citizenship, like it was candy. Congressman Morrison was quick to distance himself. He said he'd been misled, that he didn't know the full extent of Carollo's record, and that the bill was just a favor to a friend. The friend being Carollo's lawyer. He claimed he never tried to push the legislation, and that it died naturally at the end of the congressional session. But by then the damage was done. The public had seen the kind of influence Carollo could still buy, and immigration, already under scrutiny, wasn't going to let it slide. Even after the Morrison bill fizzled, Carollo tried to hang on. Legal delays, quiet extensions. He was originally scheduled to report for deportation on April 14, 1947, but managed to get 2 more weeks. Finally, on April 30th, he agreed to leave voluntarily, flying himself to Rome at his own expense. It saved the government about $450, officials said. But Carollo wasn't trying to save the money. He was trying to save face. He gave up his address, 3522 Claremont Drive, and flew out of New York with the same quiet that had once defined his rise. The government called him an undesirable alien. The papers called him a political embarrassment. And yet, because of all the noise surrounding his exit, few believed he was truly gone. By 1950, Silvestro Carollo had been out of the country for 3 years. Officially, anyway. On paper, he was still gone. In reality, he was right back where he had always operated, just outside New Orleans, living quietly behind the facade of a small business and under a new name. It wasn't some low-rent flop either. Carollo had set up in an air-conditioned hideout near Slidell, Louisiana, 50 miles north of his old stronghold, with furnishings that screamed wealth, not exile. He wasn't alone. Sharing the safe house was Salvatore Kansas City Sam Guarneri, another deported mobster with ties to the New Orleans rackets. Both men had slipped back into the United States illegally and vanished into the same criminal support network that had protected them for decades. 8 months before the raid, the property had quietly changed hands. The purchase was arranged through relatives. The name on the paperwork didn't match Carollo's or Guarneri's, but nobody at the county level was asking questions. When the federal agents came knocking, there was no gunfight, no escape attempt. Just 2 sharply dressed men surrendering in a living room that looked more Fifth Avenue than rural Louisiana. The store out front, operated by Sam DiMichele, was a front in every sense. Their real life was happening in the air-conditioned shadows behind the storefront walls. The arrests came on the heels of a wider underworld shake-up. Just weeks earlier, Charles Binaggio, a mafia figure who had merged politics and organized crime in Kansas City, was gunned down in what insiders called a warning shot to anyone trying to centralize too much power. Carollo had been spotted in Tijuana before the killing. Then he vanished. Now he was back in Louisiana, tucked away with another deportee, waiting to see if the world would move on without him. The charges were straightforward: illegal re-entry after deportation. Bail was set at $10,000 each. They were booked into the parish prison in New Orleans, where the feds made it clear there would be no second chances. Carollo's criminal record was already thick, stretching back to 1923 and packed with federal violations, narcotics convictions, and a paper trail that linked him to national racing wire operations and even the Capone organization out of Chicago. Congressman James Morrison, the same man who once tried to slip Carollo's citizenship through a private bill, was nowhere to be seen this time. In 1947, Morrison's move had failed, but it revealed just how much muscle Carollo still had in Southern politics. Now, in 1950, that political protection had evaporated. The government wasn't just keeping an eye on him. They were actively sweeping the board clean.